Einen wunderschönen guten Morgen. Bonjour, soyez les
Good morning. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Grid Forum 2022 here in beautiful Lucerne. We have wonderful weather today, and we have the pleasure of being at the Museum of Transport in Lucerne. Welcome here, of course, but also wherever you may be, whether that's in the office or in front of your computers at home. This event is, of course, modern indeed. It is a hybrid event, and we have just as many participants joining us from elsewhere as we do here on site. We will bear this in mind over the course of the day. We'll give you the opportunity to have your say, to participate, and also, of course, anybody at home will be able to participate too. We'll tell you more about how that will work later. We are here in Lucerne. Today I thought, well, the canton of Lucerne, they're doing pretty well over the past few days. They were able to celebrate a Spring King, and now they have the pleasure of hosting the Grid Forum 2022. Lucerne is having a good time at present. Is it surprising? Well, I think we were all a little surprised about some of the slightly more unfortunate events. Of course, this Grid Forum is at an extremely opportune time because several very interesting topics are popping up that are highly relevant to all of us that we will be able to pick up on today. Now, when I say discuss, I have already asked you to please participate, and what I would like to say on that note is that we have organised this event as a trilingual event. You can participate in French, German or English. If you're here in the room with me, you can hear simultaneous interpretation. You may have seen the headphones at the front of the room. Please do take a set if you want to do that. You're welcome to head over there to get one now if you haven't got one yet. Number 1, German. Number 2, French. And number 3, English. Those are the channels for you. And for participants at home, it's slightly easier because you can simply click the language that you would like to hear the event in. So, of course, you can listen in today, but we would be even more delighted if you were to participate actively. If you want to say something from time to time, you don't have to, but of course, you can ask your questions, give us your comments. This is how it's done. You can go directly to the Grid Forum's website. This is the address here, swissgrid.ch/Netzforum. Then if you are in front of a screen, you will already be on that website, and all you'll have to do is click on the questions button. This is a fairly small scale group for us here today. I'm sure you all are familiar with one another as well. Of course, the industry knows one another, and perhaps we're slightly from the outside, if you like. I'm sure you've noticed the gent at the whiteboard over there. Small Shark Michel is our illustrator today. This man is the hardest working man at today's Grid Forum because he will be following the happenings today. He'll listen in, think about what he hears, and put his thoughts down on the board there. And we very much look forward to seeing the thoughts that emerge there over the course of the day. To see that on the board will be an interesting way indeed to visualize those ideas. From time to time, we'll come back to that. What's left to say? Well, perhaps a note on today's agenda. You may have noticed that it is very dense. There's an awful lot to discuss. I'm sure you're well aware of this. There are a great many important topics today, particularly, of course, due to recent events. and we have attempted to incorporate that into our agenda for today's discussions. And you see that over the course of the morning and the afternoon. We have sought to divide that into topics, and I will be happy to guide you through those blocks, those topics. And by the end of the day, I hope we will have been able to address these things. I hope everybody will be happy. Of course, you may be a little tired, but if you aren't too tired, I do ask you to please stay with us, because we'll be able to enjoy a bit of a drinks reception at the end there. And I'm sure that will be a good opportunity to have a few more conversations and, of course, some networking. Let's go ahead and start, shall we? I suggest that we first turn to today's host. Give us a warm round of applause, please, for the CEO of Swissgrid, Yves Zumwalt. Good morning. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Lucerne.
Either at home or at the office, or at the home office, as you wish. But I guess this is a very good opportunity for Swissgrid to share our opinion today, and maybe to try to find solution together to ensure that we have a beautiful future together. But at the end of the day, je crois que vous avez tous vu.
I believe that all of you will have seen the newspapers recently. There has been a great deal of talk about sustainable development, security of supply, the relations with the EU, and production proper in Switzerland. Now, energy as a topic, if we look to the news, this is a prominent thing every day. And I believe, in my opinion, it's important to talk about it, to address these issues and find solutions for Switzerland, for the future, to ensure we can safeguard supply in the best way possible. Now, today's topics, there are three main topics. Firstly, sustainable development. This is an omnipresent topic today in other industries as well. What do we need to do to make sure development is sustainable? Secondly, security of supply. This means, of course, having the means in the future to meet demand. And thirdly, grid stability. And all of these points have to be managed, with or without the EU, of course. Now, the Federal Council last week decided on several initiatives. Their opinion about this winter is that it will be a difficult time. I believe this is correct, and that we need to work together to ensure our country is in good stead. Now, Swissgrid's role is fairly simple. We take care of the grid. We take care of the stability of the system, the voltage, etc. We also provide the infrastructure that is necessary for power plants and to make sure that energy gets to consumers as well. But it's also about security of supply for the system overall and all of the stakeholders that are involved. All of the stakeholders do have to be pulling in the same direction, if possible. If I look to the past just a little, what happened last year? Well, first of all, the Federal Council was in discussions with the EU about the framework agreement, about an electricity agreement. Those discussions were interrupted. Now, this is, of course, a difficult situation to be in. And from our side, we now need to find solutions to replace that, solutions with our European colleagues. And what has happened is that private law technical agreements have been attempting to put those in place with our counterparts in Europe to make sure that a good stability of the system overall can be guaranteed nonetheless. Now, we are in the middle of Europe, if you like, geographically, and the market in Europe as well is also something that develops over time. We're at the heart of it, but we're excluded at this time. Now, and that's where the revision of the respective acts came in. The Federal Act on a secure electricity supply from renewable energy sources. And that is currently under parliamentary consultation. I'm interested to see what will happen in Parliament, but I believe that we also need additional solutions. Even when the Energy and Electricity Supply Acts are revised, we need to make sure that then the security of supply is guaranteed. So, what happened? Ukraine happened. Gas shortage. In Europe, 20% of electricity is produced with gas. In France, half of the power plants are currently not operational. We remain hopeful that these power plants will be connected to the grid once again before the winter, but at the moment they are simply not running. I believe this is a very tense situation because we also had a lack of precipitation. You didn't even have to leave Switzerland to have a summer holiday this year. It was so hot. But what that shows us is that there are problems. Whether this is getting coal from Germany, whether this is fuel in general, supply of fuel, or the Rhine, for instance, its depth, etc. And this all has an impact on production. And so we really have to have a think about how we approach this. In Switzerland, this is the situation we're in. Now, there are different options under discussion. Option number one is that Swissgrid should acquire a hydropower reserve. Swissgrid has an issue with this solution in that as the grid operators, we would slowly like to move towards security of supply in that Swissgrid is, in essence, an insurance because we could then tap into the hydropower reserve if we needed to. But that wouldn't be enough in the future, would it? If we want to see an energy transition in Switzerland, we also need to have reserve power plants so that we can have energy on tap that we can feed into the grid if we have an issue, if we have a shortage, because that is not the case right now. I believe, sure, this was Elcom's preference that we build additional power plants in Switzerland to have a bit of a backup. But this winter, we simply do not have these facilities yet. So now, well, a virtual power plant of all of the reserves in Switzerland so that all of the energy available, all of the emergency resources can be tapped into if we have a situation where we have shortages. We are looking into that. But I believe if we need to use emergency electricity aggregates, then, diesel could be considered one of those that could be transported, and we need to be able to take care of those resources too. The Federal Council, I believe, has made a good decision to increase voltage on two lines. Begin Shippies has already been built with a 400 kilowatt profile. The line has to be adapted to reinstate that level, but provisional permission could be given to enable that to happen. And the second line is Baskow-Mühleberg, and there it would be fairly easy to operate that at the 400 kilowatt level. That would provide the required capacity. So there are a great many challenges, but I think It's important not to think only about the winter, but also to look to the medium and long term. In the past, there have been various crises. Clearly, the good thing about crises, if you like, is that there is a sense of urgency that arises. However, it causes us to think in very short-term terms. And what we should be doing is thinking more into the long term. It is important to us, I would argue, to firstly recognize that whether we want to or not, we do have to collaborate with Europe. We do have to make progress in step with our partners in Europe. It is difficult at times, but I believe that it can be done. That would be what Swissgrid would like to see happen as regards a sustainable solution for the relationship between Switzerland and the EU in the future. Secondly, we are currently working on a line in Valais. It was a long time coming. The first time I heard about this project, I was young and beautiful back in my engineer days. And now, of course, some years later, as you can see, we have aged somewhat. But nonetheless, I think this should be sped up a little bit. Last but not least, there's a lot of talk about digitalization, innovative solutions. And if I compare Switzerland with Europe, I have to say we're a little behind with our solutions. The idea here is to be innovative, to look at our electricity system and develop that in a more digital manner that relies upon data exchange and also providing and implementing efficient solutions. Security of supply in Switzerland. Today it is under discussion, and I'm delighted to have the opportunity to speak to you about this here today. But evidently, the responsibility for this is split over several stakeholders, and so I'm delighted to be finding solutions together. Thank you very much and have a good day.
Merci beaucoup, Yves Zumwalt.
Thank you, Yves Zumwald. As is always opportune for a CEO, he was able to illustrate to us why today's agenda is so relevant. And of course, there are various points that come together at a moment like this. To pick up on what was just said, I believe that we are all in the same boat. We're all responsible for avoiding the kind of situation we would not like to see in the winter. Of course, it's a very tricky situation to be in. It's a huge challenge. And every now and then, there is some nervousness in the air. And as a journalist, of course, I notice this, but also the Swiss people notice this. There are additional topics that make this even more difficult because electricity shortages is something nobody wants to see. We'll talk about that, but we'll also talk about the balancing act the industry is expected to pull off, not just here, but all around the world. It's a very difficult thing to pull off because various aspects have to be borne in mind, and also considering those against the backdrop of international policy making, that is not an easy thing to do. Security of supply has to be guaranteed on the one hand. On the other, there are political pointers. There are pointers to do with war and all of these things. This doesn't make it any easier, does it? In addition, further challenges based on the war, based on the energy crisis, that in fact is a little out of focus at the moment. But these issues are nonetheless extremely important. As Mr. Zumwalt mentioned, we have an energy strategy. We need to pursue that strategy, pursue our climate goals as well. And that is then this balancing act that we'd like to have a look at in a little more detail later on. Can this be reconciled at the moment? Can we deal with this energy crisis while also bearing longer-term objectives in mind, Energy Strategy 2050, and putting all those things into practice? Can it be done? That's what we'd like to talk about first. And in each block, for each topic, we will have certain presentations for you, keynote presentations to give you some food for thought. And on this topic, on sustainability and energy strategy, we'll first like to welcome a scientist from ETH in Zurich. Ms. Senevirate has played a very important role in climate considerations.
She is an expert when it comes to the 1.5-degree goal, and she's an expert on climate goals in general. We have to achieve these goals even in times of energy crisis, and we look forward to hearing your presentation. Good morning. I'm going to hold my presentation in English, but I am prepared to answer questions in French and German as well.
World Climate Report from IPCC, that's the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And basically what I want to show is three main points. First, we have a climate crisis, so we need to act as soon as possible. Secondly, this climate crisis is an energy crisis, so we cannot ignore it on the energy side. And third, there are a few steps we can take, and actually not everything is looking so bad, but we need to act very quickly. So here is a picture from the IPCC contributors, the authors, as you can see here at the top. We had about 234 authors who contributed to this report. This was actually the first part of the report which I was involved in. I was coordinating chapter 11, which is dealing with climate extremes. I coordinated it together with Xubin Zhang. We had authors from all over the world. There are also two more reports which have been released as part of this sixth cycle. A report on impacts, adaptation, and vulnerability, and a third report on mitigation of climate change. I should say, maybe, ich werde vielleicht das auf Deutsch sagen. Wir hatten einen Vortrag auch im Parlament in der Schweiz.
The next bit I'm going to do in German. We held an event at Swiss Parliament, and we produced some leaflets for these events. They are still available.
So the question I often get about the climate crisis is, when do we see the sign that it is really serious? Is it really that bad? And the answer to this is we see these signs now. So we cannot wait anymore. Often we hear, is it 5 to 12? Ist es 5 vor 12? Nein, es ist nicht 5 vor 12, es ist schon 12 jetzt. Wir müssen hier jetzt handeln. Here are a few examples. For instance, a heat wave in Canada in 2021. There was a temperature of 49.5 that was reached. Last year also in Germany, there were very heavy rainfalls which led to flooding. This year in India, there was a major heat wave which actually led to conditions which were the limit of human survival. And this summer, Monsieur Thunval a mentionné qu'on avait une sécheresse cet été. Ce n'est pas une petite sécheresse, c'est probablement la sécheresse la plus importante depuis 500 ans. Et nous avons vu des impacts dans tout le continent. So we had major drought in all of Europe, and actually it was most likely the strongest drought in 500 years. Finally, probably you have seen pictures from the flooding in Pakistan. This flooding has been really massive. In the last few days, there were more than 1,000 people who died as a consequence of this flooding. So first, I will start with a summary on the change of global warming. You see here the evolution of global mean temperature. Clearly, since about 1850, we have had a massive increase of temperature. So in the last decades, we had 1.1 degree of global warming compared to 1850 to 1900. This is a massive increase in temperature. This warming level is unprecedented in the history of human civilization in more than 100,000 years. So we have to imagine that all of the, for instance, agriculture has developed in about 10,000 years at temperatures which were lower than now. The main conclusion of the IPCC report is that it is unequivocal that human influence has warmed the atmosphere, ocean, and land. And finally, we are responsible for all of the warming, not only part of it. The human emissions are basically contributing to 98% of this observed warming. I should also say that if you look at CO2 concentration, very clearly we have the highest level ever measured. This is from last May, so we have reached for the first time 420 ppm, as you can see here. That's a huge amount, and it's clearly that even despite the COVID crisis, we keep on putting more and more CO2 in the atmosphere. Now, what is the reason for this increase in CO2? And it's very simple. We know what is the source of CO2 emissions. It's basically the burning of fossil fuels for almost 90%, and then land use change, deforestation. And that's why we can say the climate crisis is an energy crisis, die Klimakrise ist eine Energiekrise, la crise climatique est une crise énergétique. Here you see the combination between CO2 and global warming, so how the two are basically related to one another. The more CO2 we put in the atmosphere, the more global warming we have. It's an almost linear relationship. So as you see here, every additional emissions of CO2 leads to additional global warming. And we should say that CO2 stays very long in the atmosphere. That's why we speak of cumulative CO2 emissions on the x-axis. It's because the CO2, once it's emitted, it stays there for hundreds to thousands of years. So basically, any emissions we are basically putting in the atmosphere has consequences for several hundreds to thousands of years. On the other hand, of course, every avoided emission leads to less global warming. So our CO2 emissions have consequences for hundreds to thousands of years, as well as some irreversible consequences. So for instance, if we speak of using more gas or more petrol, all of this is going to have direct consequences for the climate system. This is also illustrating these long-term consequences as an example of the different scenarios that we looked at in the IPCC report. The only scenario which actually allowed to stabilize global warming to 1.5 degrees is the light blue scenario, SSP 1.9. And in this scenario, we reach net zero CO2 in 2050. But you see, after we reach net zero CO2, temperature doesn't go down. It just stays at about 1.5 degrees. Again, the temperature that we will reach when we have net zero CO2 emissions is basically the temperature we will have forever. And that's why it has so large consequences. Another really important message is that no region is spared. So all regions show changes in some climate extremes, and Switzerland is also particularly affected. Here I'm showing different maps of changes in climate extremes. At the top you see hot extremes. Second, it's extreme rainfall. The third is drought. And so all the hexagons, which are filled with some colored, are basically showing that we are having an increase in some of those extremes. And we see that basically every region is affected in some way by some climate extremes. And actually, West Central Europe, it's highlighted here in red, is the region where we are in Switzerland, and it's one of the most affected regions. It's actually affected at the same time by heat extremes, heavy rainfall, and drought. So we are one of the hotspots of changing climate. Switzerland is particularly affected. I'm showing here this picture from Meteo Suisse, which is showing the warming in Switzerland. The warming in Switzerland is twice larger than the global average, about 2 degrees since 1864. So when we speak of this global warming, it's an average over land and ocean. But over the continents, we have much more warming. And actually, in Switzerland, Central Europe, we have a lot of warming, as you can see here. So again, we are a hotspot of changes. Also, we see very clearly an increase in heavy precipitation. Again, a picture from Meteo Suisse. You see the different stations here. What is the tendency for precipitation? All stations where we have an increase in heavy precipitation are shown in blue. And when you have field circles, it means that we have very substantial changes. So very clearly, we are also not only affected by an increase in temperature, but also an increase in heavy rainfall. And this has consequences. I've included a picture, for instance, from a flooding in the Lausanne train station or flooding in Lucerne, just here. So at the same time, we have this increase in high temperature, but also more rainfall because warm air can entail more moisture. So when you have rain, you have much more water falling down. In addition, we have also an increase in droughts. And this is also related to the fact that warm air can take up more moisture, so it can dry up the surface. And this is from this year. This is showing what is the level of the rivers across Europe. And this is based on analysis from colleagues from the Copernicus project. And it has been qualified as the worst drought in 500 years. You just have to imagine. So already 2018 was qualified as the worst drought in 500 years, and this year is worse than 2018. And here I'm including measurements from Switzerland. It's from our measurement network, Swissmex. In black, you see the average that we have measured since 2010 in normal years. In gray, you see the typical variations in years that were not particularly dry. And the different dry years are shown in red. This year is shown in green. By far, you see that we have had the driest condition ever measured since 2010. So what will happen in the future? And here I think it's really important to realize when we speak of 1.5 degree of global warming or 2 degree, it does matter. Even half a degree of global warming difference makes a big difference, and even actually 0.1 degree. So every additional increase in global warming, even an increase of 0.1 degree, implies more frequent and more intense climate extreme events. What we found, so in this report, we'll look at an assessment for changes in temperature extremes, heavy precipitation, floods, droughts, storms, and compound events, is that we have an increase in frequency and intensity of climate extremes with increasing global warming for many of those changes. It's particularly for hot extremes, marine heat waves, heavy precipitation, agricultural and ecological droughts in some regions, the proportion of intense tropical cyclones and concurrent extremes at the same or different locations, which are also called compound events. So here I'm illustrating this for changes in temperature extremes. We are looking at the frequency of hot extremes that would have happened once every 10 years without our influence on the climate system. Such events happen now 3 times every 10 years, so they are 3 times more probable. So we are already seeing now a strong impact. At 1.5 degrees, it would happen 4 times every 10 years. Now, at 2 degrees, it would happen 6 times every 10 years. So this means that the majority of the summer would be extremes. Finally, at 4 degrees, it would happen 9 times every 10 years. About compound events, I think that's a really important point, that we see that not only we have some increase in single extremes, but we have multiple changes. As I said, for instance, here in Europe, in Central Europe and in Switzerland, we have an increase at the same time in hot extremes, droughts, and heavy precipitation. So this means that these events can also happen in short succession, one after the other. We have seen this, for instance, here. This summer is hot and dry. Last summer was very wet. We had a very intense precipitation. So many regions are projected to experience an increase in the probability of compound events with higher global warming. This includes concurrent heat waves and droughts or fires, also compound flooding in coastal regions. So in coastal regions, we have 2 effects which lead to flooding. We have more heavy precipitation. We have an increase in sea level. Finally, and I think to me this is really an important point also for Switzerland, we have more risk of having concurrent extremes at different locations at the same time. So for instance, this means some risk for food security because the different food baskets of the world could be affected at the same time by climate extremes. And we find that this risk is higher at 2 degrees compared to 1.5 degrees. I show more impacts of changes in global warming, for instance, here for wildfire damage. In this figure, you see with increasing global warming, what is the level of risk for wildfire damage. In white, this shows undetectable risk. Yellow means moderate risk, red, high risk, and purple, very high risk. That's when you reach limits to adaptation. We see that now at about 1.1 degree of global warming, we are in moderate risk. But at 1.5 degree, we will be shifting to high risk, this red zone. So clearly here, we are close to this threshold. Another really important point is the risk for food supply instabilities. I mentioned this before. And actually there, we have even less margin. So we see at 1.1 degree, we are still a bit in this yellow zone with moderate risk. But really at 1.5 degree, we will be shifting already to this high-risk zone. Here I include a summary from the second part of the 6th assessment report of IPCC, which provides an aggregated assessment for different types of extremes and different types of impacts. So the first is for unique and threatened systems, the second one is for extreme events. And you see that for all those different types of risk, we have clearly an increase in risk with increasing global warming. For instance, for extreme events, we reach this level of limits to adaptation at around 2 degrees of global warming. So above 1.1 degree, we are starting to get into high risk. That's basically what we are doing right now. One conclusion of this report was that near-term actions that limit global warming to 1.5 degree would substantially reduce projected losses and damage related to climate change in human systems and ecosystems compared to higher global warming levels. But they cannot eliminate them all. And I think that's another important point. Whatever we do, we are going to have to face the impacts of climate change. Already now, we are having very strong consequences of climate change. Finally, we have only a few years to act. We need to have CO2 emissions until 2030 and reach net zero CO2 within less than 20 to 30 years to stabilize global warming at 1.5 degrees. So we see that we have very limited time to act. And I think this, when we consider the crisis of energy, we need to consider this. It's not the time to invest in fossil fuel infrastructure. We need to reduce our emissions. We should not be investing in fossil fuels. So here I show the different scenarios that we have, which would be consistent with 1.5 degree stabilization. So scenarios shown in blue here, you see actually the evolution of emissions, so CO2 emissions. And in all of those scenarios, we have seen before the figure showing always an increase in CO2 emission. Basically, we need to go in the other direction. We need to reduce emissions very quickly. And so this requires changes which are unprecedented in terms of scale. That's the words of the IPCC. It says we need to do unprecedented changes if we want to achieve that. So first, we need to have an immediate reduction of CO2 emissions on global scale. We need to halve emissions until 2030. That's a huge challenge. We have only basically about 7 years to achieve that. Then we need to reach net zero CO2 emission at the latest in 2040 or 2050. Now, we often speak of net zero CO2 in 2050, but I always have to say, if we do that, this only gives us 50% chance of stabilizing global warming at 1.5 degree. If we want to have 2/3 chance of stabilizing temperature at 1.5 degree, we need to reach net zero in 2040, so earlier. Finally, we also need to have negative emissions. We need to take up some CO2 from the air, also after reaching net zero CO2. But we should say at most this would be about 10% of present-day emissions. So for 90% of the emissions, these emissions need to get to zero. There is no solutions, offsets, and compensation possible. They just need to get to zero. Here I'm showing the latest assessment following the COP meeting last fall in Glasgow, showing where we are on, what is the trajectory. In yellow, you see basically what are the current commitments in terms of CO2 emissions. Now, you could say at least we don't have commitments that would lead us to an increase in emissions. It's rather a stabilization by 2030. But this is not what we need. As we have seen, we need to have a decrease. So with these trajectories we have now, the commitments that the different countries have taken in terms of emission, we will get to about 2.4 degrees of global warming. But on the other hand, within the Paris Agreement and the Glasgow Climate Pact, it was decided that actually different countries want to stabilize global warming to 1.5 degrees. For this, as mentioned, we will need to have emissions. So basically, our current targets are absolutely not sufficient. We are absolutely not on track. Now, how can we reach net zero CO2? How can we decrease our CO2 emissions? And there, I would say electricity has a huge role to play. So we need to basically have no more use of fossil fuels, no more coal, no more gas, no more oil. And for this should represent about 90% of the reduction of CO2 emissions. This means we need to shift to renewable energy, solar energy, wind energy, also hydroelectricity. We also need to have clean electricity that is not basically inducing CO2 emissions. And we need to have an electrification of energy use. So we'll have actually more demand for electricity. And for the rest, about 10%, we also need to have carbon dioxide removal. So for instance, for some sectors where it's very difficult to bring emissions to zero, That's, for instance, the case for waste combustion, cement production. We might also need the production of synthetic fuels for planes. So in this case, for instance, we speak of afforestation or carbon capture and storage. But again, we shouldn't expect that these are going to be miracle solutions. At the moment, these are much smaller than 1% of our CO2 emissions. And there are a large number of caveats. So for instance, in the case of afforestation, if we plant trees, these trees need a lot of time to grow, plus they could die, for instance, as a result of the current climate conditions, if you have more droughts, more fire risk. So this is a major issue. In terms of carbon capture and storage, we have some techniques to capture the CO2, but then this CO2 still needs to be stored. So for instance, I've spoken with a lot of experts about storage in Switzerland. They all tell me, no, there is limited potential for storing in Switzerland. This means that if we want to do this, we need basically to take up the CO2 and then we have to export it to the North Sea and then put it down in the North Sea. I mean, it's a huge infrastructure you need to put in place, and we need to do this, but we are not going to be able to do this to compensate all of our emissions. So again, that's why, and especially for this first time frame until 2030, this reduction in half of the CO2 emissions, we need to focus on this top part, which is no more use of fossil fuels. And that's really what we need to achieve, this 90% reduction of CO2 emissions. Now, I don't want to only give dire news. There are some good news, also in the last IPCC report, especially the part that is dealing with mitigation. And this the last report is showing that renewables are becoming cheaper and cheaper. There are also synergies of climate mitigation with higher well-being. So actually, I think one really nice message is we could live with limited CO2 emissions and live well. We could have a nice life. And I think that's a really important message. So first, I want to show the economic part, and I think this is a really important message. This is showing, this may be a bit small, this is showing what is the potential contribution to net emission reduction if we have a shift to different types, for instance, of other energy use. If we go to wind energy or solar energy, so replace fossil fuels with solar energy or wind energy, the potential is really very high. In both cases, it's of the order of 4 gigaton CO2 per year. So it's about 10% of our global emissions. But now the really, really important message is that the color of the bar shows also what would be the cost. And the whole part that is blue would be cheaper than now. So for instance, in both cases, for about 2 gigatons CO2 per year, shifting to wind energy or solar energy would be cheaper than what we are doing right now, because fossil fuels are not cheap. They are costing a lot of money, even more now. And so this is also showing that from an economic perspective, it makes sense to have this shift. Finally, again, I think we should just realize that this shift is not something we should be afraid of. A world without CO2 emissions would be nice. There are numerous co-benefits. First, of course, we are avoiding climate change, so we would have less climate impacts and costs for ecosystems and health. But there are also several further co-benefits for health. There would be less local air pollution, less particles, less noise. If we don't have petrol cars around, we would have much less noise. And also another source of emissions is actually meat consumption. If we eat less meat, we don't need to be vegetarian, but this is actually more healthy. But also for health, having a more active mobility, basically walking more is better for health. So there are strong synergies with health. Finally, and that's, I think, something we have just seen now, shifting to renewable energy would mean more geopolitical security. We would have less dependency on autocratic fossil fuel exporting regimes. This is true, of course, for Russia, but it's also true for most of the countries exporting petrol. And so that's why I think we should see that if we are not depending on these fossil fuels, there is really something at stake, which is just geopolitical security. So I come to the conclusions. It is worth limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees. This aim is stated in the 2015 Paris Agreement and confirmed in the 2021 Glasgow Climate Pact. This was confirmed by all countries of the world. But the first essential step, and there we are not on track, is if we want to go there, we need to have CO2 emissions until 2030. And we have less than 8 years to achieve that. Obviously, electricity networks play an essential role for decarbonizations. The needed electrification of energy use to move away from fossil fuels. This is the only way we can move away from fossil fuels. And we also have a needed CO2-free electricity generation. That's a major challenge. We also need to urgently foster the energy transition. International cooperation is essential for stable electricity production. We have heard this before. Obviously, Switzerland cannot do this alone. We need also to work together with our neighbors. And I finish with this figure I often show. Every action matters, every bit of warming matters, every year matters, and every choice matters. Many thanks.
Thank you very much for these insights. Please join me here in the middle of the stage. We still have some minutes left for questions. Thank you very much also for the last slide. A lot of things matter at the moment. Wenn Ihnen das alles ein bisschen zu schnell ging, wahnsinnig.
Ladies and gentlemen, maybe it was too fast for you. We have all the slides on our website and you can take a second look at them in your own time later on.
People at home as well. If I can just take on some of those questions that have come to us, let's pick the second one. There's still a lot of skeptics, still a lot of people. I mean, you made it very clear. Climate change is human-made, is man-made. However, I have the impression the number of skeptics doesn't decrease. Sometimes I even have the impression it does increase. So how do you convince these people concretely what you just told us, what, let's be frank, we all know is a fact? But there are so many people who don't believe in those facts.
Ich werde vielleicht auf Deutsch antworten,
Sicher.
weil es die Frage auch auf Deutsch
If you allow, I shall answer in German as the question was asked in German. The question was, what can Switzerland do? People always say Switzerland is a small country. What can we do? Well, firstly, Switzerland is a wealthy country. If Switzerland doesn't manage to halve emissions by 2030, then who will? We, as a wealthy country, have a responsibility to reach this goal as quickly as possible. Our CO2 footprint is not small. Average emission is 4.4 tons per year. That's global average, more or less. When it comes to consumption, we're doing badly when we're looking at emissions caused by consumption, by importing products from China, causing emissions in China. Then our footprint increases to 14 tons, and that ranks as 15th. We could do a lot in this respect. Switzerland, the financial industry could have an important impact, could play an important role if we focus on divesting, if we stop investing in certain industries. You're a fantastic professor because you do answer questions I haven't asked, but that you've read on the screen. You also answered the first question, what can Switzerland as a small country do? Thank you very much for answering that question. Another question that's linked to that. Scientists have been telling us it's not 5 to 12, it's high noon. There is a sense of urgency, and rightly so, but there are people saying tone it down because people might despair and might start saying, well, I can't do anything anyway. Well, I think the IPCC reports do show the situation as it is. We are faced with a crisis, and you mustn't tell us stop fear-mongering. It's not about fear-mongering. We are faced with a problem, and we must solve it. But there are some positive aspects. A world without CO2 emissions would be a world worth living in. And I think people are afraid because they get a sense that things can't be done. and people are being told, do you want to have cold showers in the morning? But we could actually manage at very little cost as well to change our system.
Natürlich muss man schauen, dass man genug Sicherheit
Obviously, we need to ensure supply.
zusammen.
At the end of the day, you need to look at all the different problems simultaneously, and it would be wrong to invest in fossil fuel now out of fear. Well, you've mentioned cold showers. This is one of the options being discussed for this winter. And you said the climate crisis is an energy crisis. If you look at the current situation, we will have to talk about blackouts later on as well. But how do you strike the balance between the different goals? How can we achieve these ambitious goals if we are focused on making it through the winter? People start talking about fossil fuels again, saying it will become more difficult to halve emissions by 2030. Well, I think it's not up to me to answer these questions. But what's your point of view as a scientist? Well, I think we can do it, and it's not all too expensive either. There are a lot of possibilities for synergies. If we invest in renewables, in solar energy, if we invest in wind power, this is good for security of supply, but also good for climate. I think a crisis is always a problem and an opportunity. It forces us to reassess our situation and look at how we can change. We have to change to overcome this crisis, this energy crisis, but also the climate crisis. Let's take two more questions from the audience. Currently, we're talking about reserve power plants. Oil or gas is being discussed. What's your point of view? Is it necessary to build these plants? I think as a temporary solution, it might be acceptable, but the question is, do we really need them this winter? They're not going to help us. We're going to depend on generators. I would advocate not to forget our long-term goals. Storage, maybe hydrogen could be an option. Do we really need these gas-fired power plants? I personally think we do not, but obviously security of supply needs to be ensured. Europe and the EU is another topic. You are a scientist. You need to collaborate on an international level. You have international collaborators for your IPCC report. The framework agreement was not signed, which leads to problems. Horizon 2020 collaboration with colleagues in Europe. In how far does this affect your work? In how far does that worry you? Well, I am concerned, as are all of my colleagues. We can no longer have the lead in EU projects. Nonetheless, I collaborate on different EU projects. The only thing is we cannot have the lead. Obviously, that's a very bad thing for Switzerland. We have to take certain decisions, and it makes me sad that Switzerland does not have this dialogue with Europe. Fossil fuels means depending on autocratic regimes, on autocratic states. And I think the question we need to be asking ourselves is, do we want to depend on these states? I would much rather work with our neighbors. Our neighbors are more or less acceptable, at least they are not autocratic states, they are democracies. Why should we not collaborate with them? I think that's a good final question. Thank you very much one more time for your presentation. Thank you for having been here, and you might want to have another look at it on our homepage. Thank you very much for having been here.
Ja, da wurden viele Themen aufgeworfen und aufgebracht und
A lot has been said. A lot of these topics have aroused an interest in the audience. The current situation provides food for thought for all of us, and that in particular concerns those of us having to take decisions. We wanted to take a closer look. Swissgrid sent out a reporter to talk to three main players to ask them how they see the current situations and to ask them what solutions they propose. Steffi Bosshardt went to meet these people at their respective places of work. And let's start with our number one, Steffi, with her first visit.
We'll be speaking to Benoit Revin shortly. Let's see what answers he has for us. Mr. Revin, what can be done to accelerate the expansion of renewable energies and the grid in Switzerland? It's a big challenge. It's a hot topic in policymaking too. The important thing is that cantonal energy planning is better harmonized with power providers and grid operators. So there's the expansion of the grid, then there's our relationship with the EU, which currently does not encompass an electricity agreement. How can this situation be normalized over the long term? The intention is still to reach an electricity agreement, but we have to address certain institutional issues. There are private law agreements between TSOs. That's important, but it does not replace an agreement looking to the future. As director as the SFOE, you make decisions every day that have a tangible impact on the future of energy and the environment. How do you deal with this responsibility? I personally, but also the SFOE in general, take this responsibility very seriously. Thankfully, we aren't required to shoulder it alone. In particular, our collaboration with the industry itself is very important, as well as other levels of government, cantons, cities, municipalities. Another hot topic is sustainability. What is important to you when it comes to sustainability in the energy industry? Efficiency. Saving energy is always somewhat overlooked in the whole discussion. There's a lot of emphasis on production, infrastructure, but the very first fuel is energy efficiency. This is something we need to take into account to a greater degree. Sustainable mobility is also crucial, not to mention the various process improvements to be made in industrial activities. The measures you mention affect various stakeholders, including the electricity industry and Swissgrid. What would you like to see happen in the industry? Decarbonisation entails a great deal of electrification. This means the electricity industry's role will be developing. It will be critical for the transformation of Switzerland's energy system. This is important in connection with the digitalisation of the grids. Close collaboration with customers too, who today are no longer strictly customers, but also owners of flexibility, at times producers themselves, and not least good collaboration with our own cantons, cities and municipalities. Monsieur Revin, thank you for speaking to me. Thank you. Benoît Revin from the Swiss Federal Office of Energy, because the industry itself also has things it would like to see happen, expectations of government. So let's move to the other side of the table, if you like, to speak to another important stakeholder in this conversation on energy and the situation at the moment. So what about the electricity industry itself? This brings us to our second video statement. Stephanie also visited VSE. We're in Aarau now. We have a meeting with Director Michael Frank. Security of supply and decarbonisation are a priority for all of us. But who's responsible for what and on whose behalf? Well, we know we have a climate problem. We know we have to rid our system of CO2 as soon as possible. In principle, there is only one way to do this: decarbonisation. That means electrification, renewable energies, mind you, otherwise it's pointless. And that's where the industry comes in. And it does take its responsibility seriously. It has to make the implementation possible, but not alone. Everyone has to pull together and want to do it for the climate and for security of supply. In this context, we often hear about the power plants, but of course the grid is important too. What is particularly important to you when it comes to grid stability? The principle is simple. The grid is half the battle. Without it, nothing works. We know that too. It's very important. It's often overlooked, forgotten, in policy making too. But we know that with increasing decentralization of production, we have to adapt the grid to that, to make sure it is built to accommodate the new conditions. And that's on a technical level within Switzerland. Then there's another level, namely the foreign policy level. We need to be better connected to Europe. That goes hand in hand with grid stability. We need an electricity agreement to firm all of this up across Europe. Are there any areas of tension that you focus on specifically? You've mentioned several. What are the most important ones? The area of tension that has been well known for a while now, that we don't seem to be able to shake, is the climate. Since May 2021, we have a new area of tension to deal with, in that there is no framework agreement, therefore no electricity agreement. Now we have to react accordingly. The federal administration published a study in autumn 2021 that said 25 electricity shortages or more may occur. That aggravated the next area of tension, security of supply. And then a few months later, Russia invaded Ukraine. Europe in a state of war, major energy crisis in Europe, which opens up the next area of tension. The gas supply is no longer secure. The electricity supply is also increasingly at risk. These topics are huge for us. We also see this in a neutral representative survey conducted by the association. The population ranks security of supply the highest, that is, above costs and the climate. How could the situation between Switzerland and the EU be normalised? We have to be pragmatic and compromise, talk to one another, because without negotiating with one another, there can be no new agreements. Both sides need to have their say, not just the Swiss, but of course I speak in the interests of Switzerland. We need to get more done, be more flexible in other topics as well, not just as regards electricity. There seems to be a certain consensus on that, but I think the most important thing is to make progress, not just with technical agreements, in fact living hand to mouth, but with longer term bilateral agreements. We need to compromise in the interests of safeguarding supply, having a stable grid. It's in all of our interests at the end of the day as private individuals and as an economy. One agreement we do have with the EU are the network codes. One of these is a cyber security network code. How can we accelerate its implementation in Switzerland? The network code on cybersecurity hasn't quite been greenlit by the European Commission yet. We're familiar with the draft and our associations committees and working groups are discussing it. There are several discussions underway, as was the case for previous network codes where there was collaboration with Swissgrid, and these insights have been incorporated into industry documentation. So we're practiced at this. We have some experience. The cybersecurity network codes are special, of course. It's very important to see this Europeization, if you like, this harmonization and standardization to make sure we're all talking about the same thing. Also for Swissgrid, with its partners across borders, across grids, that they're using the same language, the same standards, the same level of security. That's something we want to incorporate. Certain aspects have already been incorporated into VSE's documentation. We'll continue to work on this and update it when we have the definitive cybersecurity network code. You've talked a great deal about different areas of tension, security of supply, decarbonisation, partial collaboration with the EU. The industry is always at the heart of that. Is it willing to tackle this? Does it have the stamina? Can it do so quickly enough? The industry has been around for over 100 years, and if it wasn't willing, didn't have the stamina and wasn't quick enough, it would never have achieved that. We'll be around for the next 100 years too. I think that question is answered. We want to do this. It's our job, it's our responsibility to run, expand and adapt to the country's most important infrastructure, but not alone. Society and policymakers also play a role, and we know that many projects, hydropower, wind power, solar power in the Alps are in the pipeline, but everything is blocked. Everyone wants renewables, decarbonisation, but the projects can't get off the ground. We need to pick up speed as a society, take off the brakes, but that requires everyone, really everyone, society, policymakers doing their bit. VSE has compiled a security of supply roadmap with over 14 measures, including how they could be distributed over the timeline to ensure security of supply and gain speed. The industry is ready to get off to a flying start, it seems. What would you like to see happen in the industry? The industry operates the most important infrastructure for Switzerland. We can't do anything without electricity here. It forms part of our prosperity. Our system is based on it. That's a huge responsibility, but at the end of the day, we are never alone. We win and we lose as a country, not as an industry. We're always in the same boat. It's important to rally together, get these hurdles out of the way. Not for the industry, for Switzerland, for all of us. And let's be honest, that will enable us to ensure security of supply and protect the environment. Thank you for speaking to me, Mr. Frank. Michael Frank from the VSE Association. We have the pleasure of his company here today as well, by the way. If you have any questions for him later, I'm sure he won't mind taking a moment to speak to you over coffee later on. International collaboration, cybersecurity, all of these topics will be picked up again later on. That's topics 2 and 3. So, we have heard from the association, we have heard from the government, but we also need to hear what the situation is for our regulators. ELCOM, then, is making the headlines recently particularly as regards the sale of candles having been boosted in recent days. But we didn't visit the president, but instead the managing director. Today, we're at Elcom in Bern as part of the Grid Forum 2022 to find out what Ausmeister has to say on current issues. Various stakeholders look to Elcom. On one hand, Swissgrid, the electricity industry, and end consumers. On the other, policymakers. Surely you can't keep everyone happy. No, definitely not. There are a great many conflicts of interest and differing goals on this market. Balancing production and environmental considerations, the interests of producers versus consumers. But then Elcom is a regulator, and it's only natural that companies aren't always pleased by our decisions. Neither are consumers at times. That makes it all the more important that Elcom doesn't represent specific interests, but instead seeks to optimize the efficiency of the market at large. What is particularly important to you when it comes to security of supply? I think many political debates equate security of supply with national self-sufficiency. You have to consider all this in relative terms. Of course, it is important that Switzerland has enough of its own production capacity, particularly because there are certain limits to what we can import. Trade, being able to import and export electricity, is also an important factor in safeguarding supply. Being truly independent of other countries would not only be very difficult to achieve technically, but also extremely expensive, and Swiss consumers would have to pay for that. Switzerland has now envisaged the Energy Strategy 2050. Two very important bills are currently under parliamentary consultation: the Electricity Supply Act and the Energy Act. What would you say from Elcom's perspective about the current status of implementation? We are slightly concerned about the implementation. Expanding renewable energies, further developing market design and safeguarding supply all depend on long-term framework conditions, those being stable over the long term. Revising the Electricity Supply Act and the Energy Act will provide these framework conditions. It is currently underway, but progress is slow. Development on that front is overlapping with short-term developments, notably in connection with the Russia-Ukraine war. These short-term measures have to be harmonised with long-term measures, but also kept separate. You've just addressed the conflict between Russia and Ukraine. Then there are various nuclear power plants in France that aren't connected to the grid. Electricity prices have risen considerably. The situation is tense. Is Switzerland prepared to weather a power crisis this winter, and are there any preventive measures to take? Well, various measures and mechanisms are prepared. We are currently working very intensively on preparing the hydropower reserve, ensuring that backup reserve is available for implementation as early as this winter. Austral has also taken preparatory measures to take effect in the event of power shortages. However, we also have to be realistic here. These measures and mechanisms will not enable us to connect new production capacity to the grid by this winter. So if there are gas and electricity shortages in Europe, the likelihood of Switzerland being affected is high. When there are shortages of this kind, we need to curtail our consumption while keeping costs to society and the economy to a minimum. But of course, this will entail costs and inconvenience. Evidently, this is a tense situation. Do you believe the energy industry is willing to tackle this? Can it do so quickly enough, and does it have the stamina to reach its goals? I'm an economist. To me, it's less about whether the industry is willing and more about whether it is given incentives. These have to be created under the respective framework conditions. I've already mentioned how important the revision of the relevant acts is, but also the framework conditions for planning permission for power plants. Here too, improvements can be made. If the correct framework conditions are in place, I believe the investment incentives will be strong enough. The will and commitment will follow automatically. Perhaps a last question. What would you like to see happen in or for the energy industry? I would like to see the energy industry contribute constructive and creative input to the discussion of market design, not just representing interests, but also acting as a credible partner to the administration and policymakers. Mr. Meister, thank you for speaking to me. Thank you. I look forward to hearing these topics being discussed at the forum.
Thank you very much, Urs Meister, Michael Frank, and Benoit Reva. Mr. Meister said he was looking forward to hear how we are going to discuss these issues. We shall do just that. Sustainable energy supply is the topic of our first panel discussion. I would like to invite the participants to make their way to the stage. Yves Zumwalt, CEO of Swissgrid, has already spoken to us. Next is Dr. Antje Kangieser, CEO of Alpiq, has been in this role since 2021, worked for BKW as well. She knows the industry. Christian Petit from the French-speaking part of Switzerland. Welcome, Mr. Petit. We also have a participant joining us remotely. We are going to have hybrid panel discussions, and as you might have guessed from the background, Professor Dr. Rolf Wüstenhagen is joining us from Berlin. He is professor at St. Gallen University. Can you hear us, Mr. Wüstenhagen? Yes, good morning, Mr. Greding. I can hear you. Well, that's good to hear. Before we start our discussion, I need to address one more point. We have talked a lot of power shortages. There is a gift shortage in this event. I still owe a gift to our first speaker, Ms. Seneviratne. My apologies for not having given this to you earlier, and thank you very much one more time for your excellent presentation. Sustainable energy supply is our topic. I will follow the same procedure for all panel discussions. I shall start out by asking you, what are your current problems? What are your current priorities? We have a lot of topics, a lot of buzzwords that we have to address. If we hear all of this, if we look at all of this, and Mr. Zumwalt, let me start with you. What are your priorities? Well, I think Swissgrid has a role to play in the overall system. We're connected to the European system to assure grid stability, and that means we need to strike a balance between production and consumption. We need to bridge these gaps. If the gaps become too big, we have a problem, and every player has to do his part to supply energy to the end consumers. We have several problems. Collaboration with Europe. We have an energy strategy that's partly based on imports. We're trying to build up production capacity in Switzerland, but in the winter we need to import energy from abroad. And what's happening in Ukraine, what's happening in Europe, accelerated a process that had been ongoing already. We are preparing for the worst, if I may say so. We have different scenarios. We have one that says things work out. We have one that says there might be some bumps, and one that says things don't work out. We also have a task force. When talking about production when talking about Swissgrid. We're working with the Swiss federal government to find solutions from the production side. On the demand side, I might say the best kilowatt hour is the one that's not being consumed. On electricity shortages, you might want to ask the other two panelists about their views. Alpic represents the producers, Christian Petit as well.
Of course, we'll talk about that as well. We're not entirely sure what will happen. I don't know whether the winter will be, whether there'll be a lot of rain, whether it will be particularly dry, you know, all these things we just don't know. I do like the sun, but we do have to be prepared for the worst. As Candy's a company like yours also has to be prepared. It's one of your major management tasks at the moment, particularly when the situation is so insecure, and every day we hear about this and from companies, of course, but also among the population. As regards your opening statement, how do you see the situation at the moment where there are so many different threads to pull together? Where do you have your priorities?
I have 4 priorities. And the first of them means stable production. I don't want outages in our power plants. We must make sure that we manage all our processes well to use our production as its best. Most of our production has been sold, and we must ensure we can produce the energy we sold. A lot of actors hoped prices were coming down. A lot of customers waited. Are they still waiting? No, I don't think they're waiting any more. But the markets have dried up, and it is becoming difficult to buy energy for the winter. Mr. Zumwalt mentioned different projects that are being blocked. When I talked about solar panels in the Alps, people only frowned upon that last winter. Now we're having a fast-track procedure for these projects. And a 4th priority is reducing energy consumption, and we try to implement that in our organization, which is, I think, important for the winter.
Mr. Petit, we hear a great deal about reducing consumption, about doing something ourselves, that's a possible approach. That's one of the major topics, I imagine, for you too. Is that a priority for you at your company? I think the electricity companies that I represent today are in a especially close proximity to consumers. And so we have the possibility to work on both supply and demand. Now, of course, supply is our priority today, to develop that, to expand renewable energies, evidently. But then, of course, there are consumers who are producers themselves, people who are able to feed solar power back into the grid. So you have the distribution, you have our business operations. Perhaps we'll come to speak of these later again. This is all part of this decentralization that is happening. Then there is the other aspect, the demand aspect. And that's where we come in, really communicating, raising awareness, giving recommendations. And these revolve to an ever greater extent around managing demand. Now, first of all, we started talking about energy in broader terms, but of course we wouldn't be credible talking about the energy transition if you're selling energy, and because we want to sell energy, we want to sell electricity. So we do have to take this extremely seriously as a stakeholder looking to safeguard efficiency as well, providing that electricity. And today we have gained a reputation for this. Now, taking this one step later, perhaps, here in this context, we could aim to reduce our usage. Now, very often, what has been the case is that people lowered their consumption and then stopped thinking about it, and it was all undone. Now, this all is interlinked. And what we have heard this morning, and what we'll hear over the course of the day, is that we simply don't have a choice. We do have to consume less. We consume too many of this planet's resources. It is simply not possible to continue as we are currently underway. We heard that this morning from the professor. Will we be lucid enough to see this necessity? It's difficult for production because, of course, there's money involved, and that's difficult because we're giving recommendations to use less. I'm sure we'll address this later on, that this is something we really have to delve into. We should indeed.
Well, you talked about reduction and the fear that instills in some people. With that, I'm turning to you, Professor Dr. Wüstenhagen. You're an old hand, if I may say so. You have been working in the industry for a long time. You were on the advisory board, worked with Doris Leuthard on the energy strategy. If you look at the current situation, I think we can all agree that we're faced with a situation with an unprecedented degree of urgency. What are your current priorities? What are the most important decisions to be taken? Well, you called me an old hand. Your interpreter apologizes, but he cannot understand what Mr. Wüstenhagen is saying, as the sound quality is very, very poor. I want to focus on 3 points. If we look at Europe, we've seen the different wildfires. We know that we have to reduce CO2 emissions. We know we must burn less CO2 and gas, but we have not done it. On the contrary, we're emitting more than ever. 36 gigatons of emissions were produced last year. I think this is one first major point. Second point, the war in Ukraine. I think it was a wake-up call. We have our energy strategy 2050. We know where we're headed. But in certain areas, we haven't been making enough progress, especially when it comes to hydropower and wind. We moved too slowly, and I think this wake-up call can help us to accelerate, to put our foot down. On a positive note, e-mobility, solar power is booming. I think wind and hydropower needs to catch up. Third point, the markets are very volatile, which might lead to social disruptions. Energy prices for end consumers are going up. At the same time, Shell, BP, and other major oil and gas players are reporting record profits. Shell alone reported a quarterly profit of 10 billion euros, and at the same time, end consumers are being faced with price hikes. And I think this is a situation similar to the one in 2007, when the CEO of Citibank at the time famously said, "As long as the music plays, we have to keep dancing." Whatever that means for us in this current situation. Mr. Wüstenhagen, you're comparing the current situation to the financial crisis in 2007. You're taking quite a sober and pessimistic look. You said there are also some players making major profits. The situation for Alpic is different. You've made huge losses. Do you see any way out, or are we in a state of panic and we just have to wait for things to get back to normal as quickly as possible? Well, I do see the danger of social tension. I think the current price levels aren't healthy, and what we're seeing now is not going to stop tomorrow and is not going to be over after this winter. Mr. Gredig, you mentioned the losses we reported. This is an accountancy issue. We sold our production years ago, and this is being compared to current pricing levels. And if you sold for less than 100 and now you have prices then of over 1,000, then that leads to these billions of losses. But once this is being delivered, that's out of the books. What we need to do now is produce more, and we need to produce in a CO2 neutral manner, as Professor Sevratnik told us. And the second point is we need to reduce consumption. I agree with Christian Petit. We have been told years ago that our CO2 footprint is too large. And this crisis is our opportunity to get creative and use our possibilities. All these emergency generators is something that could have been done 10 years ago. Currently, people are starting to insulate production sites, and that could have been done years ago. There are a lot of levers that we can still use to reduce energy consumption. We can also use gas-fired power plants. There are these power plants abroad. We have to buy the electricity, but to call for gas plants to produce electricity rather than using gas for process heat is something that we need to really look at very closely. Is that really the solution, or should we not rather change our behavior? Well, in the short term, people are calling for these reserve power plants, for gas-fired power plants. There are those calling for another nuclear plant. How do you see that, Mr. Petit? Do you think the crisis can undo the work of the last 5 or 10 years, or are you convinced that we are on the right track and that we mustn't go back?
Well, I believe, first of all, it's important not to separate these things out too much, having energy and climate being looked at too separately, because, in fact, this is one and the same topic. When we talk to our clients about being careful about how they use electricity and also their footprint, that's essentially the same thing, and the people we talk to understand this. So that is one important thing to note. Then, as regards the Energy Strategy 2050, are we going quickly enough? Well, I believe that together, from here on in, from 2050 onwards, we also have to look at nuclear power, our entire electricity system, and making the correct forms of energy available. Now, our country, today, you could argue it's the most hostile towards renewable energies, and that is the direction we're currently moving in. If you're looking at hydropower, and if you have 2 gigawatt hours, and then look 20 years later and discussing 20 years, the same situation, and that just can't be right, can it? Our neighbouring countries are also democracies, they're also discussing this. So basically, despite being such an instilled democracy, we have to be able to deal with these issues quickly. So that then becomes a topic for our government, for administration. Somebody needs to take responsibility for this. And then, as regards usage, we can be optimistic. Some people will be supportive of these developments, especially towards the winter. Of course, if we are able to reduce consumption at all, that wouldn't be a bad thing. We are being asked to save energy. There are various options out there for companies as well. If you are the grid operator, then, Mr. Zumwald, surely that's frustrating for you. What can you offer in tangible terms? What can you do to improve the situation?
Well,
Swissgrid, in terms of a company transmitting electricity, looks at this with a very long-term perspective. We have 51 lines. We work together with European partners, and that is the overall system in general. Now, what's happening in Europe is an underwhelming, overriding movement. And we heard in the video, there's been many years now where we've been constructing a system, and now it has to be adapted because the environment has changed. Now, this adaptation process has to be done more quickly, whether that's because of the situation in Ukraine or otherwise. Now, at Swissgrid, we have to provide the infrastructure to make this transition possible, and we have the same problem as the producers because we have to adapt to that. And, if we are adapting a line to differing values, and if we've got tunnels and all of these kinds of things, that's all similar. What we really need here is a bit of oomph. We need to get going. Not to forget, our colleagues in Italy, for example, who have problems with their grids. Here, if we look to Germany, and they've been able to find solutions for their grid, then there is a kind of split between different grids in Europe, and all of Europe has been affected by this. All of Europe has been impacted. From my perspective at Swissgrid, I come back to my primary role of providing the infrastructure to make all of this possible, to provide the voltage, to provide this synchronization throughout Europe. And currently, in discussions, we seem to tend to, and of course this is a bit of a political topic because we ask who is responsible. We say, look, this is the problem. Let's come up with a sticking plaster solution, something provisional. Let's give Swissgrid a role that is in a way counter to our own ideas, because that's at the basis of what we do. We have a different approach when we're looking to safeguard the grid, etc., etc. So we're developing a system then that has to be balanced overall, and that is extremely difficult. The more you work on that basis and change different things, the more difficult it becomes to balance things, to really take control. There are technical considerations. Switzerland attempting not to be discriminatory, to having however many kilowatts provided in real time. I believe that is the problem, really, because we think and we act in real time, but actually all of these things have long-term repercussions.
You mentioned Germany and you mentioned possible problems in Germany. I don't know what happened if it was the German grid. We lost Mr. Wüstenhagen for a moment there, but he's back. It's good to see that the line is working. Mr. Wüstenhagen, we talked about having to feel the crisis before making cuts. Who is first in line to make these savings, to reduce consumptions? Obviously, we as citizens have to do our bit. But how about private business? How about governments? How about Swissgrid? What's your view? Well, when it comes to influencing demand, I think pricing is very useful. We do see major increases, and the reactions have not reached the end consumers yet, but this is something that we are going to see. And obviously, politicians can do their bit as well. The federal government is communicating to the population, is explaining that saving energy is not only good in financial terms, but will also help us overcome this crisis. This is something that's going to help. This is a topic that has led to a lot of questions from the audience as well, and I would like to discuss some of these questions with our panel. You cannot see them, but I can see 5 pages full of questions. Let's take the first one. Do you see the energy strategy 2050 as failed? Do you agree? Let's pass that question on to you. And let's maybe start out by saying the goals we've set ourselves have moved a bit further down the line. But would you go as far as calling the strategy failed? And if not, why not? No, I don't think the strategy has failed. I think we have to accelerate. We maybe have to take another look at the goal, but the direction is the right one. We need to decarbonize. We need electrification. Do you agree?
I think the direction Switzerland is taking is a good direction, really. It's the framework agreements that may be a little lacking. I think perhaps some plan Bs could have been put together in this regard so that we were better prepared for emergency situations, because the overall direction is fine, but I don't believe Switzerland has been pragmatic enough about this and hasn't had enough foresight. I believe there is an element of strategy missing there. There are certain framework agreements that we need. You need to know what those are. Then you need to know what you can achieve, what plans you can put into practice, and then you also need to weigh up whether they're realistic.
Mr. Wüstenhagen, you worked on that strategy. A new vote is being called for by some. Maybe rethinking the nuclear phase-out is something other voices are calling for. What's your point of view? Well, I am somewhat biased, but let's take a look at the alternatives to this strategy that was voted by 58% of voters. You could build new gas-fired power plants, or you could build oil-fired power plants. You could build new nuclear power plants. You would have to hold a new vote, which seems to be happening, or the process seems to have started in Switzerland. But if you look at the experience from other countries, building these takes 25 to 30 years. Costs are 3 times as high as costs for new solar and wind power plants. So if you look at the different options, if you look at the different alternatives, you come to the conclusion that the strategy points in the right direction, saying goodbye to high-risk technologies, reducing consumption, increasing renewables. Let me ask another question that was also asked by the audience. We talked about how long it takes before you get permission to build anything. Heritage protection, environmental protection. Now people are calling for these requirements to be reduced. Is that necessary? Well, you might have asked with regard to the climate crisis, are we moving fast enough? With the war in Ukraine, urgency has increased, and obviously we must look at what are the major obstacles and where we can accelerate. If it takes 10 or 20 years to build a wind park, if it takes the same time to make a dam higher, I think the question should be asked if the processes are the right ones. If you should ask, is the system as it stands really helpful? Well, all panelists seem to be in agreement here. Let's take another look at the questions from the audience. This is a question for Yves Zumwalt. From a Swissgrid point of view, what has to be done to increase production for the winter?
Well, Swissgrid isn't a producer, is it? I mean, this is part of a system throughout Europe. But do you have any recommendations? Well, we have had recommendations for a long while now. You know, the objective is fine. I believe we all agree on Energy Strategy 2050. But what I think we disagree on is the path thereto and the speed at which we are progressing. There seems to be a certain level of hope that we can take away power plants and at the same time provide additional sources. But of course, it doesn't work like that. It takes 3, 4, or 5 years, and we have the next crisis. Every time they roll around again, you know, we look back, whether it's issues in France or wherever the crisis originated, you know, new crises, public health crisis, pandemic, another crisis. And you mentioned this, you know, the tariffs are just a topic for the upcoming years. They're horrendously high. So considering all of this, we seem to be hoping everything will be fine, but what we really need is a strategy to say, this is what we need to get it done. These are the resources required. This is the plan. Each year we have to achieve this and this and this. And also, what do we do if it doesn't work? Alternative solution, done. And so this really has to be a little bit realistic. I think we tend to forget that we have made decisions with Europe. The population takes certain decisions. Of course, it's great for people to have their say, and that's fine, but we need to progress faster.
Mrs. Kangise, maybe we do need the current crisis, or do we? It's 5 to 12. in Switzerland, in Europe. Maybe this crisis is our wake-up call that finally gets us moving. You said we should see this crisis as an opportunity. Maybe the people will understand that it's 5 to 12 and will realize that we take electricity and power for granted and it's not God-given. Well, in the future, we will be able to answer that question properly. I think we're faced with the worst energy crisis since World War II. We grew up in a world where gas came from the pipeline and electricity came from the socket, and all that matters was the price, and the price was to be as cheap as possible. And this is something society got used to. Our infrastructure is 20, 30 years old, and people got used to the situation as we know it now. And that's why it's difficult, because if I don't feel the consequences, I always look at the guy next to me or the woman next to me and look what they are doing and follow what they are doing. I hope the crisis will act as a wake-up call, will give us a push, but we're faced with some very tough decisions. And people will probably either start playing the blame game or will call for major solutions and call for new nuclear power plants. And I don't know where we're going to end up. I think it's up to us to explain and maybe it's up to us to have the political courage to take the more difficult road.
Mr. Petit, this is a collaborative effort, really, in a situation like this. Your clients, the population, we've heard that there is significant risk of this being a crisis among society. If we look to the UK, for instance, where people have to ask themselves, are we going to heat our homes or are we going to eat this winter? Now, I imagine you attempt to give recommendations under these circumstances where to save energy. Now, how do you do that in detail? How do you do that as a company of your kind? Well, yes, you're quite right. The energy crisis will also be a social crisis. It's absolutely clear. It's a very complex ecosystem. To Caritas in Switzerland, 7% of the population in Switzerland is below the poverty threshold. Now, if the population is looking at, for instance, an extra 100 francs each year, it's not nothing. There will be more people falling below the threshold, and that is quite considerable. And that has to do with electricity and gas, and the lack of those, of course, will cause prices to increase. And so within this particular context, policymakers, social insurers will have their own roles to play. Now, when we give recommendations, we try to see to it that our customers are able to reduce their own consumption. And I agree with you. It's not that society has to be miserable because they're consuming less. We can still be happy and consume less electricity. It's a bit of a change of attitude, and it is, of course, an attitude that has become ingrained over a long period of time. So it's quite a delicate topic because you are depriving people essentially of what they're used to, both in private individuals and companies. And so each and every one of us has to take our own individual stance on this. Now, we have a program that involves local communities where we provide coaching on energy topics to families, for instance, who are looking to reduce their consumption. And coaches go out to, say, fairs and look at the 3 pillars of consumption different areas of consumption for the local population. And then these families, on a voluntary basis, are able to reduce their consumption of greenhouse gases by 25%, or, of course, their emissions, right? So local communities working together with other authorities, council authorities, with other partners, taking the issue in hand, this renewing the situation here, if you like. So what about construction? Restoring buildings. Buildings have a huge role to play in energy consumption. And so there are a great many steps to run through up until the point at which work can start on buildings. Montreux have all joined this particular program, and I believe that our role there is to simply make it easier for people to take the steps that they want to take, addressing administrative issues, permission issues, and also construction issues, to take away the hurdles that are there hindering people from making the right choices.
We have only 2 minutes left. Maybe one final question to Ms. Kangiese. We talked a little bit about pricing, and we talked about everyone doing their share. As end consumers, we have stable prices. Not all businesses do have that. What do you think about flexible prices for final consumers? Well, I think you should ask my colleague, really. There were different tries, flexible pricing for end consumers. Most clients do not want them. Now prices have reached a different level. Maybe you could take a new look, but Mr. Petit, maybe you have some recent figures on flexible pricing.
Tomorrow there will be an announcement about price increases, and that will really set the tone, unfortunately. And so this benchmark price, if you like, has a significant impact, and tariffs are tied to that. We don't have free rein over tariffs. There are models that have been developed in Europe, around the world, that look to price benchmarks, and you look at what the commonplace price is supposed to be if consumption is, say, normal, and then if consumption goes above a certain threshold, then of course there are price repercussions, which is not what we want. And the authorities are trying out different things to try and impact the price, and the prices are just going through the roof.
We look forward to hearing what prices are going to be announced tomorrow. We've heard it's difficult to forecast the futures. You're being asked time and again what this winter is going to look like. Mr. Zumwalt, I don't expect an answer from you. You're not a soothsayer, but will we make it or not?
Now, of course, I don't have a crystal ball, unfortunately, but Swissgrid will do everything it can in its professional capacity. If policymakers want more intensive collaboration, we're happy to assist with that, but we will keep a clear head. We will consider all of the possible scenarios and attempt to react accordingly.
Stay calm and keep going. Well, I am very optimistic, but security of supply and supply of electricity is very important. I think we cannot lean back, and this is true for this winter and next winter.
Am I a realist? Well, I think really, just as Isa said, we don't know, do we? The French, do they want to be reconnected? Does it need to be more centralized? we'll just have to see what happens in the winter, you know. But we do have to get through this one way or another. The biggest thing, the greatest impact can be had by simply adapting our consumption habits. So does this then become something that is legally mandated? Is this something that we simply adopt as a collective? Or you know, how do we address this? Half of Swiss residents haven't changed anything at all just yet, and then there are the other half who have already changed their ways. And actually, the fact that people are already changing their ways gives me some reason for optimism. Now, of course, let's see what the case is in November, shall we? But I think it's more about consumption than production. Okay, save energy, save, save, save. Are you still with us over there in Berlin?
We talked about collective intelligence. Is there such a thing? Well, I think our opportunity is that a lot more people are thinking about these issues. A lot of homeowners are thinking about solar energy, about other forms of energy generations, but I think it's going to be a difficult winter. And yet there was a little bit of optimism in your statement, which we take into the break. Thank you very much for having been on our panel. Thank you very much to Berlin. Ladies and gentlemen, before we take a little break, I invite you to take a look at what Small Shark, what Michel has been up to this morning. He's filled about a quarter of his canvas. I think he must restrain himself to not fill everything too quickly. I am most certainly going to take a look at what his conclusions are from this morning. Global energy crisis is something I can read. Let's hope we get some optimistic voices and hear some positive statements later on this day. We're going to have our first coffee break. You all deserve a good cup of coffee. If you have been listening via headphones, please keep them with you so you can continue using them. Enjoy your coffee break and look forward to seeing you back here.
So, ganz herzlich willkommen zurück.
Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. A great big compliment to you. Right on time, you're back. I can tell that this industry knows how to deal with deadlines. Thank you very much. If we can keep up with this time management until the end of the day, I am quite sure we are going to be having our drinks on time later on this evening. We are getting to block number 2 of this morning, and it's going to be held in English. So, should you need interpretation, I would ask you now to pick up a headset. And for all of those who are listening in via their own computer, you can just switch to the different language. Also,
this morning already, and let's be honest, we have been talking about this topic for months, if not for years, because it's one of the topics that is on a very high list on the agenda for politicians here in Switzerland, but also for companies and, of course, for us all. It's our position in Europe. As we all know, we're part of Europe. We're in the middle of Europe, and yet, however, we are not part of Europe when it comes to certain questions, one of which we're going to discuss today. Where does Switzerland fit into the whole energy transition and the whole energy situation in Europe, that is one of the tricky questions that a lot of people are thinking about, not the least, of course, politicians who have been trying to find an agreement, to find a link to Brussels, a link to Europe, which we all know hasn't worked so far, I would say. But if you listen to a lot of experts in that field, it will become trickier and trickier. In the field of energy, we all know we're also there, very kind of in the middle of it all. We're a transit country. We have 41 transit points to our neighbors, and the question remains, how will we fit into what's going on and what is the future plans of the European power systems and the whole energy question. We will start with a look at where we are at the moment, and we have one of the authors of an interesting book about that very topic, Beziehungen unter Strom. Was the title of the book, and I just had a little chat with him, and he said, okay, now we can just move on one further step and say Beziehungen immer noch unter Strom oder vermehrt unter Strom. It's about Switzerland, electricity, and the European Union. He's Professor Emeritus at the EPFL and one of the experts when it comes to infrastructure and this topic in general. So please welcome Matthias Finger.
Thank you very much for the nice introduction. Wir hätten es auf Deutsch können ou en français.
We could have done that in German as well, but here we go.
It's a pleasure to be here. I retired 2 years ago already. I retired 3 years ago from ELCOM, so but I'm following the matters. I guess that's the reason why I was invited. I wrote this book with just as an introduction, a little bit gossip, with my doctoral student from Holland, who today advises the Minister of Energy in Holland in matters of Europe. The origin of the book is interesting. We were working on these things. Paul van Baal was working on his PhD on these topics. And the Swiss National Science Foundation had a project, 2 big projects, BNR 70 and 71, 50 research teams, I think 11, 12 million Swiss francs on the energy transition and energy demand. We did not apply. It started in 2016. In 2018, some review body in the parliament was saying, but Europe, there is none of these 50 projects is about the relationship with Europe. And so I was asked to write something about Switzerland and Europe. But we are at the end of the project, has to be quick, and we don't have any money left. So Switzerland does not like Europe very much, but Switzerland also does not like controversy. And so in order to be sure that it wouldn't come out too critical, another professor was asked, not the one who was here, but from the same university, who is known for his more moderate positions about the relationship with Europe. And we were asked to do this together, which I refused. So at the end, we had 2 things on the relationship with Europe, and this is my book. I think it's updated a little bit, but it's still very relevant. And if I may, just to quote the last sentence of the cover, which says, "To be part of the single European electricity market is a condition for implementing the 2017 decided energy turnaround or transition, as well as for the country's security of supply." This was written, it's published in 2020, it was written in about 2019. Okay. So that's the background. Now, I will, maybe just as an introduction, and I think you all know this, but Switzerland was at the core of the European system. The Stern von Laufenburg, the network, which was the center of the dispatching in Switzerland. The big companies, the Alpix, Enoka, Axpo, and all these, they were instrumental in inciting the European Union to go into trading, to create the European market. So Switzerland was very much playing a key role. It was totally under the radar of politics. The companies did the job, and they did a very good job. Okay. And it worked. And all this worked until the 1990s. I will come to that. Now, today, I have just a few jokes. I don't have many slides. The recent excitement that I'm seeing, I will recall the history because we shouldn't be excited. We shouldn't be surprised. It's all there. And now we have the perfect storm, and maybe at the end, maybe some provocative proposal. Okay, so you have this, it's in German from the newspapers, Energieinfarkt, Kerzen, Taschenlampen, Brennholz, candles, things, that's what we hear from the government. Strom lockdown, suddenly the government must fill the dams, and then below AKW länger laufen lassen. Länger als was? Longer than what? And this, I put the last one because my co-author was sitting on the other side of the table when Minister went to, Sommaruga went to Holland to ask for gas. Okay. We were never received in Switzerland. We had never any political audience to discuss. I'm not complaining, I'm used to this. But when she asked for gas, the minister politely said, "We have solidarity in Europe. Maybe ask first in Brussels." Okay, so this is the things that we have to do. You don't have to read it. We know all this. Now we're still at the Sparappelle, and then at some point, things will get cut. Now, the relationship, the title is not very good. The relationship with the EU has never been easy ever since the EU started to liberalize the electricity market. Before, the companies did the job, also on the European side. Okay. So among companies, vertically integrated companies, the system worked. In 1996, the EU started its electricity, and 2 years later, the gas market liberalization with the first energy packet. Basically, the EU starts to take the initiative. And this is, I was a professor of all the infrastructure, all infrastructures, exactly the same in railway, in air transport, in all the other, telecom, postal service, things like that. Okay. EU takes the lead. Okay, so on the left-hand side. Then still, we got the inter-TSO compensation. Swissgrid was playing a role in all this. The second energy packet came, market opening, the independent regulatory authorities came. Then 2003, ERGEC, which is the Association of the Regulators, Switzerland got excluded. I was in ELCOM at that time. From then on, we were excluded. I'll come on the other side why. Then the EU in 2006 started the regional initiatives, which wasn't, frankly, a very good idea. And the EU is trying to backtrack from the regional initiatives. But the consequence of that was that Switzerland was in the region with France and Germany, and not necessarily in the middle anymore, and lost the lead even over that region. France and Germany started to play the big role for that region. And then we have the 2014 mass immigration vote, which is basically the end of the bilateral approach. I'll come back to that in a minute. And the Commission said, you cannot have an electricity agreement with the EU if you do not have a general institutional framework agreement. That was a big change. I'm adding a few other important things because in the same year, Barroso, who was the commissioner, left the Commission and Juncker came. Big change. Barroso was a friend of Switzerland. He studied with me in Geneva. He was very much in favor of Switzerland and tried to fix things. Juncker was the opposite. Switzerland, a competitor to Luxembourg in the financial sector, okay? And then at the same time, a little bit later, Brexit, statuer un exemple. We wanted to show an example and not let Switzerland do anything particular. And now we have the fourth, or clean energy package. And since then, we are gradually excluded from everything, from the trading, from intraday trading. We cannot participate in the day-ahead trading. We are totally excluded from the ACER, that is the Agency for the Cooperation of Energy Regulators in Europe, which is based in Ljubljana. Okay? So not much left. On the right side, I think it all starts with the referendum on the European Economic Area, after which Switzerland went into this bilateral approach. Okay? I think there, can't remember, but about 19 bilateral agreements that Switzerland signs on research, on railway, on transport, on aviation, on plenty of other things. Okay? That was the approach ever since. Okay? And there weren't really many problems at that time. On the electricity side, good relations with the EU continued. There were ideas we should also have a bilateral agreement with the EU in the electricity side. Okay? So that idea came up somewhere in the late 1990s, but there was no really a need. But the liberalization started, and one of the demands of the liberalization was that Switzerland would have a TSO, a transmission system operator, which was not the case. Okay? When I started in ELCOM, there were about 50 pieces of the high voltage grid in different hands. Of course, the biggest ones, the BKW, NOK, they had the biggest pieces. But there was a coordination problem, and the EU pushed for some sort of integrated TSO in Switzerland. And so the companies among themselves got their act together, created E-Trans first, which then turned into Swissgrid. Then we had the vote in 2002, where basically the vote of the electricity, at that time it was called the Electricity Market Law, which was basically the transcription of the liberalization packages of the European Union, and the population voted against it. Okay, but the EU was not really alarmed by that. We have good relations, we work well with the companies, and the government promised that they would do a new vote with a new law, which would be the same but would have a different name. Okay, and but still, and then Swissgrid was created, so we were compatible with what the EU wanted. The new law, Elektrizitätsversorgungsgesetz, instead of market, but is exactly the same as before, was finally adopted, but with all kind of caveats, not total market opening. We're not totally compatible with the EU, but the EU, we always promised it would come at some point, okay? And we work well together. And at that time, the formal negotiations for a bilateral electricity agreement started. There was a lot of goodwill. Minister Doris Leuthard met, I can't remember who he was, a German minister in charge of energy, commissioner, and they shook hands and they said, we will do an electricity agreement. And it was not really a big problem, okay? So the real first, and I see that it's on the left side, the blackout. The attitude of the EU started to change with the 2003 blackout. First, on the technical level, what is going on in Switzerland? The blackout finally, Switzerland was not held responsible for all this, but there were some doubts, and the critique was, of course, that all these bits and pieces of the transmission system operator were not well coordinated among themselves, and that pushed for the creation of E-Trans and then Swissgrid. I'll have to hurry up a little bit. So then the mass immigration initiative, I already said, that was the end of the electricity agreement. It was stopped. Then in 2017, we decided the energy transition, and that's my critical point. Even though we knew that without an electricity agreement, we cannot fulfill the energy transition or the energy turnaround. We are dependent on imports. It was known, but the agreement would come, okay? Then we started to reopen the discussion, and everything ended on May 21, when the negotiations about the framework agreement stopped, okay? So that's it. That's the end of the discussion with the European Commission in energy, but in many other areas, okay? In other sectors, we have a little bit more goodwill. In railways, they still think Switzerland is a model country. In aviation, but in electricity, no more discussions. Okay, so we have the perfect storm. Just to remind everybody that Swissgrid has warned since 2015 that we would have security of supply problems in winter, spring. And ELCOM, of which I was part, first didn't believe it because we weren't really good friends with Swissgrid at that time. And we did our own calculations and confirmed that the calculations of Swissgrid were correct. Then so we are going towards a security of supply problem. Now, this is exacerbated, and in red, the one that really concerns the grid, by the fact that we have no agreement. We have no market coupling. We have to buy the capacity and the energy separately. We have huge grid flow, loop flows, and the loop flows are increasing because in the EU, in the meantime, there's a lot of trading. So more trading, more loop flows going through Switzerland. Increasing, but I think Yves has already told you that, increased balancing costs, redispatch costs, and of course, a reduced import capacity. Because of the loop flows, we have less space to import electricity, if there is electricity. This is furthermore exacerbated by France, from where we are importing a lot. My latest news yesterday was that from the 54 French nuclear power plants, 32 are down. Okay? So France is importing itself. Okay? This is exacerbated also by the drought in France because they cannot run at full capacity if the ones that are running because there's no cooling water. This is exacerbated by the Ukraine war. There is a lack of gas for electricity generation. Okay? And by the way, the EU is also very hypocritical because I work in Turkey a lot. they asked the Turks to sell them Russian gas, okay, to the EU. So we need the gas, but it's difficult to get, and the Turks want it for themselves first, okay? The availability of gas in Switzerland, of course, and I should mention this point. No gas agreement. At some point in the discussion between the EU, there was some low-level discussion between the EU and Brussels about gas. The EU reminded Switzerland that of the 4 packages, gas liberalization packages, Switzerland has not transposed a single one. We have followed in electricity, in gas, we have done nothing. So it's very difficult to negotiate with the EU if you have not done anything in the whole liberalization process of gas. Exacerbated by the energy transition, exacerbated by the electrification of everything, and also, this was the panel before, the lack of renewables, speedy renewables development. So that's my last slide. I don't think there is a plan B. And I also agree that the energy transition is a good strategy. It should be done, but it should go faster. Implicitly, yeah, it's me. Implicitly, I think we have already abandoned the Paris Agreement and the energy transition. Nobody dares to say it, but I think we have, and we're not the only country that has abandoned the Paris Agreement. Then we have a series of discussions, massive solar, even that is slow, a few caveats. It does not really solve the winter and the spring problem, the solar, and actually it kills the price of the water in summer when we will have an overabundance of solar and we need the money from selling the electricity from water, okay? But I think it's still necessary, we should do that. We want to keep the dams full, very simply paid, but they are not really a storage replacement. It's a patchwork. And the opportunity costs, I know that now a lot of people are calculating the opportunity costs for the companies of keeping, for keeping the water in the dams. They will be huge. Okay, who pays that? And gas-fired plants or even oil, I hear. Okay, so location problem. Where do you want to put? We can hardly put a windmill. Where do you want to put a gas-fired plant? There will be the same opposition. So slow, and I don't know whether you're aware of this, supply chain problems. To get a gas turbine, it's 8 years now, okay, on the global market. So you cannot go in massively into this. Policy coherence, I think at some point we should talk to the people and say, sorry, we cannot keep Paris under these circumstances. We have no gas agreement with Europe, no desperate transposition of any gas directive, and in any case, there isn't that much gas. So just as a, I don't know, it's not a joke, but I don't really see an alternative. Why does the government, I mean, basically today the government says all these different Stadtwerke, all these different utilities, they should put renewables and they should do something. But first they look for themselves, which is okay. They are not necessarily working for the interest of the country. So I think what we need is an emergency investment fund into renewables, but not just solar, wind, geothermal, and this is totally unacceptable because we still are in this liberal discussion. Probably we need a state-owned company at the federal level that implements that policy with that fund, together with the local utilities, but much more there. And we need legislation that helps to take the land, to accelerate the process. Basically, I see no other process that is really possible at the current situation. So thank you very much. Sorry for being long.
Thank you very much, Matthias Finger, for some interesting and also provocative thoughts at the end. We all heard your alarm clock, which means, unfortunately, we've run out of time, and we don't have time for questions now. But can you give us the promise you're still sticking around for everyone who would be interested in hearing more about the book, maybe the next book, and some more of the provocative thoughts of Matthias Finger? Please just go up to him and ask him everything you always wanted to know about.
The alarm clock was not for me, it's for the energy crisis.
Okay. I haven't forgotten your gift. Thank you so much, Matthias Finger, for the moment. So if I wrap this up in just one sentence, if the relations between Switzerland and the European Union would be a Facebook relationship status, I think it would be fair to say it's complicated. And it stays complicated, as with many things around this topic. But I'm aware of this, that when we talk about international energy, with all the flows and with all the operations, maybe we tend to be a little bit kind of, we have the naval view, we just tend to think about Switzerland, we tend to think about the European Union and maybe the relations between these two, but sometimes it's good to kind of broaden the discussion as well, which we will do now as well, because other countries and other continents are maybe dealing with the same issues, dealing with same problems, dealing with same questions, and it's always good to kind of broaden the discussion and see how others are doing, which we will exactly do in our next keynote speech. We have Dr. Renuka Chatterjee here. She's Vice President Operations at the Mid-Continent Independent System Operator, MISO. She basically manages operations there, an organization which aims to do nothing less than, and I quote the homepage, than planning the grid of tomorrow. How does that grid of tomorrow look like? How do operations look like, which will bring us into the future? We're very happy to have her here today to hear about all this. Please welcome Mrs. Chatterjee, please.
Good afternoon. I guess it's just after noon, so it's good afternoon. My name is Renuka Chatterjee, and I serve as the operations leader for MISO. And let me tell you a little bit about MISO so I can kind of give you a little bit of sense to compare Switzerland and the EU. In the United States, we have several independent system operators. Think of them as countries in the EU. And we have some utilities, and they are very similar to countries in the EU. And we all work together to accomplish the policies that are made. MISO is not a policy maker, but we influence policy, we take policy, and we implement. So as we head into the discussion today, we don't own any assets. MISO does not own any assets, so that independence gives us some boldness to make recommendations on how we plan the future. Today, I'll focus on what we call the reliability imperative. And the word imperative was chosen intentionally to show a sense of urgency with which we must move. I was hearing a discussion earlier that the renewables aren't coming faster. I will say in our footprint, the renewables came faster. And I'll tell you, in 2005, when we were operating the grid, we had less than, about 1/10 of the wind we have today online. And if gigawatts mean anything to you, we had like 1 gigawatt of wind, and now we have 25 gigawatts of wind. So that's so much more wind we have today. So we put this imperative together, and the plan has 4 parts to it. Operations of the future, which I'll discuss in detail today. We'll touch on market redefinition. And then the 2 things we'll not talk about today are the market systems enhancements. So our technology systems that we use to operate the grid need transformation. So there is much better technology today that we need to leverage in terms of making sure we do that efficiently and securely. And there is a cybersecurity discussion this afternoon. as well. And long-range transmission, again, I'm not familiar with the locations of wind, but in the United States, the wind is located much, much farther away from where the load centers are, where the demand centers are. And it's not co-located where the current gas and nuclear plants are. So we need new transmission to bring that wind. So the long-range transmission plan is the plan that enables new transmission infrastructure. And it's one of the most controversial topics, I would say, in the United States in terms of building transmission lines. So with that, let's get into a little bit on the operations of the future and market redefinition. We kind of divided these two areas into further objectives, and I'll cover the market redefinition first on this next slide. Uncertainty and variability. I talked about how wind moved from 1 gigawatt to 25 gigawatts, and we had to learn how to operate better with that wind. I'll give you a couple of examples from a grid operator's perspective, right? So I love all fuels, I'm fuel neutral, I'm pro-climate, I'm all of that good stuff. But at the end of the day, we need the lights on, right? We'll miss the Wi-Fi before we miss the light bulb. So modern world does not know how to function without electricity, and much less the utilities like sewage, transportation, water, all need electricity as well. So in my experience, I've seen with the wind that we use, which is great, right? It provides low-cost energy, which we all have a social responsibility to do. But in December of 2021, we had 36 straight hours of no wind in the entire footprint, literally zero. When that happens, what do you rely on, right? So where is the energy going to come from? I mean, again, I'm indifferent where it comes from, but we need to keep the lights on. So it's our job to make those questions transparent. I'll give you another example. In February of 2021, many of you may have heard the Texas cold. So we don't operate in Texas, but we have a small portion of Texas in the MISO region. There was 12 straight days of low wind for much of the United States, the eastern and southern part of the United States. 12 straight days, that was a lot of cold. So public safety, again, weather-wise, there are parts of the United States that get really cold, so electricity is not an optional thing, at least for the December months or the winter months. So learning how to manage that uncertainty and variability is a question for us now. We can turn everything on. We can have every generator that we have turn it on and make sure we keep it on. But that isn't good enough because that raises prices. So we are designing reserve products to help manage that uncertainty and variability. Resource models and capabilities. More recently, we have enabled the storage model, the electric storage model. Most of the storage, I'm aware, gives you 4 hours of storage. But think about when I referenced 30 hours of no wind, batteries still need to evolve to make sure they can cover that kind of storage need. Location, one of the things that we learned as we started to redesign the grid with the renewable energy sources was, the constraints that we knew of were different. So pockets of our region were more difficult to get electricity to. So we have to study those local regions to make sure we are keeping a close vigil. So that's another important element. Coordination. Someone earlier said a lot of energy flows through Switzerland. If you look at MISO or our website, we are like a strip that goes from north in the Manitoba all the way to Gulf in the south, right through the middle of the country. So a lot of flows go through us. So we have 5 other independent system operators we work with. We have what are called joint operating agreements, and we have also market-to-market agreements where we can exchange energy, we can ensure that the lights stay on across the border footprint, and that needs to evolve as well as the generation sources change. So I'll start on the operations of the future, which is my passion for sure. You'll probably be able to tell as I talk through it. Many years ago, much like the artist back there, I met him earlier today, Michael, during coffee, and we were having a meeting talking about how we are going to operate the grid in the future, and one of our artists drew this picture for us, and I wanted to take a minute to cover The dashboard represents the different kind of analytics that the control room must evolve to. In the old days, our operators knew what the big generators are, the nuclears, you remember them, you make decisions. With a lot more diverse generation portfolio, we need more analytics, more information at the tip of their fingers so they can make decisions. The empty chair represents something, at least for the US. We have a workforce that is going to, 30% of our workforce that does the grid operations is going to retire in the next 5 to 10 years. We're trying to get ahead of that to make sure we have enough people to operate the grid. Simultaneously, we're also transitioning the skills. In the past, past experience was a good indicator of what you must do. It is still relevant, but as you look into the future, we have to have a more insights-based operation. And I don't need to underscore technology. It is at the core of everything we do. So operations of the future has 5 major work streams, and I'll cover a couple of these. Operations preparedness. So when we think about preparedness, we are drilling scenarios. What decisions are we going to make? How are we going to make transparent information? So today, we didn't do this in the past, but since about 3 years, I think, we post a weekly forward-looking sufficiency report so people can get a sense of what kind of electricity is going to be available, and if there aren't, both the members can work with the public, the politicians, everybody can get involved and say, well, what actions are we going to take? MISO is projecting we could be short in a week. So that kind of preparedness is needed. Critical thinking capabilities, right? So we learned that wind in our North Dakota, where it can go to like minus 30, 40 degree Fahrenheit, those wind farms needed cold weather packages. It's just a matter of installing them. We didn't know. So the wind farms actually shut down when the temperature got to minus 20. That was a huge opportunity for us to learn. So critical thinking capabilities, asking the right questions. And then ultimately, flexible operations workforce is also something we are trying to build that helps us prepare to the operations of the future. Critical communications. I'll tell you, MISO app, you can get it on your phone. It was released 2-3 years ago in a need to create transparency. And we have everyone, all the politicians, everybody gets information when we actually issue notifications. Everybody gets notifications at the same time, and it was a huge need because you don't want to shock anybody, right, that we are going to be short. Because we don't own any assets, we have to show what's available and what's not available and kind of make that communication. Auto event recording. One of the things we try to do is we look back and say, how well did we do? And today, it involves a lot of operator interviews. How did the grid work? And when we get questions all the way from our utilities in the region to politicians, we want to be able to explain what happened. So we are trying to create, much like the flight recorder systems, to record what we did. I'll cover a couple of more things so we can have time for questions. Operational continuity, because you have cybersecurity in the afternoon, I want to touch on this a little bit. The toolkit is very important here. So we want to make sure we have, we can't operate the grid manually, particularly when you have a large, diverse resource portfolio. We want to make sure that we have manual processes or other backup processes. You could have 2 data centers, but they both may be susceptible because they probably look alike. It's like having 2 cell phones. They look very similar. You may want something different. So building that business continuity tool is essential. Control room redesign. We had a very traditional way of control room layout. People sit, have monitors. There are big wall boards. We are actually redesigning the control room to make sure there are more appropriate tools for the people and how the jobs are evolving. Interoperable systems. We want our market systems, our utility systems to talk to each other in real time so information is available. And then seamless multi-site operation. So this is using those features of the cloud to make sure as a grid operator we can at all times have access to the tools we need to maintain reliability. I didn't touch on situational awareness, and I think there is something called predictive risk analysis we are working towards. So as we look, a month out, a year out, earlier today we talked about, someone referenced spring and fall weather. It's maintenance season, and we tend to see a lot of supply shortages during that time. It's actually not in summer. Summer is easy, everything is on. But we are having more difficulty during the automated, in these fall and spring scenarios where we are trying to do predictive analysis. Now, we can argue about whether the scenario was too risk-averse or was it appropriately quantified, but at least we will do the analysis and we provide the scenario, what's going to happen, and then we can get some engagement from the appropriate entities to make necessary policy. This is where I say we influence policy by providing information to the policymakers. I have a small video that I wanted to show on the operations of the future, and after that, I'd be happy to take questions. There's not much in here other than, we have to continue to invest in technology to make sure we happen. I'm sure talent was already a hard thing to manage, and COVID has not helped it. So we continue to struggle with maintaining trained talent. And then, as many of you know, a lot of the grid operations requires you to be on site, so the remote work does not work for us. Our operators through the entire COVID were in our buildings operating the grid. So that's something we are also learning how to, transition as we learn new skills to work remote. And again, retaining and managing the same talent is a huge opportunity right now in the next couple of years. I don't know how long it'll take for the dust to settle post-pandemic, but that's something we are actively working on. So in conclusion, I wanted to show a short video that describes our future operations. I guess.
Technology is rapidly changing the way electricity is produced, distributed, and consumed. Grid operators like MISO now have better access to tools and processes to ensure efficient reliability. For example, machine learning techniques combined with high-speed computing can provide useful insights into the dispatch of generation, identification of load patterns, and mitigation of transmission congestion. On a typical day, a control room operator will have instant access to essential data, leading to proactive decision-making in real time.
Electra, give me a status update.
Conditions in the MISO footprint are stable. The current load is 92,417 megawatts. The projected peak load for today is 112,449 megawatts, occurring at hour 17. There are no active system alerts, warnings, or events.
Electra, what does south sufficiency look like?
Currently, there is a 6% capacity margin with a load of 29,102 megawatts. There are 2,000 megawatts of imports, and the regional dispatch transfer is 1,800 megawatts flowing north to south, with 800 megawatts stranded.
Electra, what's causing these stranded megawatts?
The stranded megawatts are a result of the Grimes to Mount Zion 138 kilovolt line for the loss of Grimes to Ponderosa 230 kilovolt line, driven by the Perky to Diana 345 kilovolt line forced outage in Southwest Power Pool.
Electra, run a study and provide alternative options.
Here are 3 options to improve capacity.
Electra, select option OA2.
To confirm, you would like to send a start notification to the Sabine Unit 4 generator, is that correct?
Yes.
A start has been issued for the Sabine Unit 4 generator.
In the future, MISO's ability to deliver exceptional value hinges on our ability to anticipate and enable a shift toward a more digital future. Harnessing the power of innovative technologies could allow operators to work proactively rather than reactively to help keep the lights on.
Electra is modeled after Siri and Alexa and whatever virtual assistant you're used to. Again, we don't actually have this, but it's a vision we are aspiring to, and that's the sense of information we need at our fingertips to operate the grid more reliably. So with that, I'll take any questions. Or
thank you very much. Strategy. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
As we're running a little bit behind schedule, and as we will have you on the panel,
Sure.
I suggest we take the questions for afterwards. So if you have any, please go to the website, and if you're in front of the computer, go to the website and ask the questions there, and we'll be very happy to take them on board for the panel and the discussion we'll have later on. For the moment, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yeah, and we'll move on directly so that we will have a little bit more time afterwards for the discussion, the panel about all the international aspects that we're looking at in this part of the morning. If there's one thing that I'm sure, whether it be in Europe, in Switzerland, or in the United States, everywhere, all around the world, if there's one thing that is a challenge for the industry, it's policy and technical challenges. And that's something we were going to discuss and hear about in our next keynote speech, which is from Mark O'Malley, professor from the consortium Global Power Systems. And if I saw it correctly, on the internet, on the website, they bring together key actors to form a rapid clean energy transition. So quite a challenge in itself. We're very happy to have him here. The stage is yours. Mr. O'Malley, please.
Okay. So thanks for inviting me here today, and I'd like to thank all the previous speakers because they've made my life very easy, actually. In particular, the speaker just before, Renuka, I think you invited me here not because of my technical know-how, but because I'm from Ireland. Because Ireland, Brexit, the reason Brexit is in trouble is because of the border in Ireland. So I think the Swiss situation is a bit like Brexit, and the Irish situation is a bit, I don't know if there's an equivalent, but anyway. So the venue we have, I think, is very important. This is the Swiss Transportation Museum. And the one thing I love about Switzerland is the public transportation system. It is the best public transportation system in the world. And I think if any country can do this transition, it is Switzerland, because it is mainly speaking an organizational issue. So I'm afraid if the Swiss can't do it, the rest of us should just give up. The title, Enemies or Dance Partners, Technology and Policy in the Energy Transition. So Maurice, where's Maurice? So Maurice is hoping I'm going to be controversial. Michelle back there is hoping I'm not going to be controversial. And Eve is wondering whether I will or will not mention his electric car. And I don't know whether I should or not, but we'll see. I think Eve, though, at the very start said some very interesting things at his very first when he came onto the stage. But mind you, I think he should come onto the stage a little bit more of a dancer, you know, because he said he's a good-looking man, so he should probably get a good-looking woman to come on the stage next time. Because I think we're more on that side of I don't think we're enemies. I think there's a danger that we would be enemies, but I don't think we are. So to introduce just my own perspective, everyone has their own perspective. They look at it from their own point of view. I have had a very international, I've got a lot of experience in Ireland, the UK, the US. I spent a lot of time in the US. I've worked in China as well, Australia. And if you look at the Swissgrid on the right-hand side, there's no two power systems are the same. They're just not. They all have their so they're all individuals, yeah? But if you have experience with 3 or 4 or 5 systems, you will probably know everything about the system. Like, I'm not saying definitively, but experience from the United States, China, Ireland, and Australia probably gives you everything you need to know about Switzerland. If you just had experience from one of them, you probably wouldn't know everything about it. So if I only had experience from Ireland, small system, Switzerland about the same size, in that respect, they're equivalent. Ireland is an island, though, and Switzerland is right in the middle of a system, so you'd miss that part. So my experience comes from sort of having experience from multiple systems. The books on the left-hand side is, I built an office in my house during COVID, and that's my favorite book. Myself and my wife had an argument over, she wanted so many books, I wanted so many books, so we had a compromise. And that's my favorite bookshelf. And if you look at that favorite bookshelf, you'll see that most of them are engineering books, but not all. And if you want to know where my sense of humor comes from, there are some books in there that give an indication of where they come from. So, but I am an academic, so that's important from my perspective. The picture in the bottom right shows my electric car, and I'm not going to slag off Eve's electric car now, but that's my electric car, it's a real one. And 2 bicycles, and they're very relevant to this talk. I have 2 bicycles, I cycle both of them, okay? And keep that in mind for later on. So the energy transition, it hasn't been said directly, but I think Renuka got very close to it. I think the statement should, in all these talks, should be the leading statement. maintain supply-demand balance reliably, cost-effectively at all locations and times. That's essentially what Swissgrid is about. It's what MISO is about. They're all about that. And I think it's worth saying every now and again, because it's a very simple statement, but it does encapsulate everything that you have to do on a grid. It's much bigger than electricity, and that's been touched on as well. I mean, 10, 15 years ago, you could talk about the electricity system almost in isolation of a lot of other systems, but not now. You know, transport, heat, we've mentioned it before, they're starting to merge together. So the picture in the top right shows this energy system both across all the vectors. Data's in there as well, which we've mentioned, but it's also across spatially. We've talked about, you know, we've made some mention of demand side management. Things are becoming much more interconnected. And I've got a statement there that says that nothing individually new, but everything in between is new. What I mean by that is the individual piece of technology we've had for a long time. There's nothing really new in the tech. There is some new technologies. I see smart wires are there. There are some new technologies, but largely speaking, all the technology we have is well known. It's how they interact with each other is what's different. We're putting them all together, more complicated, etc. And that's what's different. It's an enormous challenge. That's why we're here. But the two last points, so I mean, I'll deal with the last point first. MISO and Switzerland are central. That's one of the reasons, I mean, that's one of the reasons Renuka's here is that although MISO is clearly a different system to Switzerland, it clearly shares the same aspect that it's right in the middle of a system. So they're different, but they're similar. And that's a theme I'll come back to many times. You need to crack the chicken and egg problem and avoid putting the cart before the horse. They're two, you know, sayings that are somewhat contradictory, but in the chicken and egg situation, you've got technology developers and the system. And the technology developer says to the system, what do you want? And the system says, what can you give me? And that sort of needs to be, if we want this to happen quickly as everyone wants it to happen, that chicken and egg problem always works out, but needs to be accelerated. And that's one of the reasons that we set up the GPST, which I'll talk about later. I also noticed in the system Robert from Poland is here, and Robert saw me speak in Brussels recently, where there's a lot of cart before the horse type of things going on here. There's a lot of people solving problems. There's a lot of people putting in policies for technical solutions that we haven't developed, and I find that a bit strange because we don't actually know how to solve it yet. So the technology, you know, we need to solve things physically first before we go to the policies. So look, the trend is dramatic and clear. I'm going to talk mainly about renewables, but I think it's very clear. Look, I mean, nuclear is part of it as well. CCS, if you can make it work, so we've dealt with that. But I will concentrate on the renewables because, to be honest with you, right now, globally, they are the part that's growing the fastest. But I'm not saying that it's all about renewables. There's a report on the right-hand side there that talks about going towards 100%. I'm not advocating 100% renewables, but a group of us got together to talk about what it would look like as we go towards 100%, because we found that in the, let's say in the academic, here I'm going to be nasty to my academic colleagues. In the academic literature, there was a whole bunch of academics saying it was easy, there was a whole bunch of academics saying it was impossible, and we decided as a group of people who are sort of academics in industry to look at it seriously and see. And the answer is, it's not easy, but it's not impossible. It's a real hard problem. So I'm not advocating, but it is the context in which I'll speak. So it's mainly about wind and solar, and I think Sonia showed that very well. They're the two cheapest, but saying that they're the two cheapest doesn't mean that they are the cheapest in the systems perspective, which I think has to be pointed out very seriously, but I'll leave that detail to later. If you look at the physical, I'm going to deal with the physical characteristics. I'm not going to deal with the policy issues specifically because I'm really here to talk about, I'm a physical engineering type, and I'm going to show, you know, that the policies need to, I'm basically going to say that the physics dominates the policies, okay? That's my conclusion, which I think is pretty clear, and if anyone disagrees, yeah, good luck to you. So if you look at the physical characteristics of the renewables that are coming on, there's three things that are important. They're inverter-based resources. They're essentially power electronics. And that diagram at the top with the spinny things is trying to illustrate that. And I'm not going to go into it in huge detail. Renuka dealt with it very well, though. The other one, variability, she spoke about it. So it's variable, you know. It's not intermittent. It's variable and somewhat difficult to predict. And it's also spatially. I mean, these renewables, I mean, somebody talked about putting wind in Switzerland. Your wind resource isn't great, but if you put them at the top of the mountains, it might work, but you know, you may not want them at the top of the mountains. So I think the spatial issue is important. It's been mentioned here many times, but again, I think it's worth pointing it out. One of the things that make this complicated is that there's a huge number of stakeholders. Like, you know, there's Swissgrid, there's the regulator, there's the generator, blah, 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 blah. There's just an enormous number of stakeholders, which are shown here. And everything has to happen over different timeframes. So there's a planning timeframe, operations time frame in real time. So it's a very complicated problem because multiple players or multiple time frames are making multiple decisions, and therefore it's very complicated. But here's probably the most important slide, the governing equations. So being an electrical engineer, Maurice, a mechanical engineer, being an electrical engineer, I suppose I put Maxwell's equations first. Who knows Maxwell's equations? Oh, good, there's a few people do. Then the laws of thermodynamics, they're pretty important too, yeah? And then we've got Newton's laws. Then on the bottom, I've got, you know, random variables. You know, we're getting more into the, I mean, they're still pretty rigorous, but they're a little bit, you know, it's random, so it's a little bit less rigorous, if I could say that. But then we get the supply-demand balance and the economists, and then we get to the policies, whatever. The top three are the laws of physics, and they cannot be broken. The bottom three, well, certainly the bottom two on the right, have to conform to the top. In fact, there was a statement made by someone, I think it was the guy from LCOM, is it? The regulator? And he said that, I don't really care if they want to do it, I just need incentives. I don't care how many incentives you give me, you cannot change the top three laws. You just can't do it. So I think that's the missing piece, that somebody said the grid's not getting enough attention. The simple fact of the matter is policymakers need to understand, they need to say, there's a set of basic physical laws, and no matter what you say and what you do, they don't change. And unless they understand that, we have a problem. And I think that may be the root of some of the problems we have. So electricity is different, but power systems are the same. So I've been a bit, you know, I mean, the reason electricity is different, I mean, different than many other commodities, is that it can't be stored, essentially. I mean, yeah, it can be stored, but, you know, in essence, it can't be stored at any volume at all. Now, you can store it by converting it to a different form, but there's all sorts of, you know, economic and technical and also cost issues to do with that. The map in the middle of the world is when I want visuals, I just go into Google and put in a few words and get them back. It's great. But that shows you all the synchronous power systems in the world, apparently. They're not quite global. Some places in the world don't have them, but they're different colors, etc. The simple fact of the matter is all those systems are the same in many respects, but they are individual, if that makes sense. But the book on the right, which is one of the books that sits on my shelf, I have 3 favorite books, this is one of them, is a book called Spot Pricing of Electricity. Who's read it? Renuka has 2, 3, yeah. It is, and it came out, I mean, the man, unfortunately, Fred Schweppe died soon, or I think he died actually before the book was published. But if you read that book, I mean, it basically brings economics and engineering together, where the engineering physical laws dominate and the economics has to adapt. So they're all dealt with by that. This is where the transportation issue becomes very important. So I've shown my car and my 2 bicycles. The reason I have 2 bicycles is that 18 months ago I came off the older bicycle on the left and ended up in hospital for 5 days. And I survived. But my wife told me that there was no longer going to be mountain biking going on. And therefore she asked me to get a more sedate bike, which is it's a hybrid, it's more of a road bike. So I'm in transition, so I use the bike on the left to go down and swim. It's only 1.5 kilometers, as opposed to 30 kilometers in the mountains, so I'm going to live. And the bike on the right is more for going long distance. But I use both bikes at the same time. The reason I use that analogy, and I have the airplane in there, is that what you're trying to do in this transition, there's no 2 bikes, yeah? I mean, MISO system is MISO system. MISO can't go and get a separate system. Switzerland can't. You've got one system, that's it. You're not going to replace it. You're going to have to change it as you go. So the analogy I'll give you, it's like changing the aircraft engines on an Airbus 380 as it flies. That's what you're trying to do. That is essentially one of the biggest problems that system operators have. It's, you know, in theory, if they were to build it from scratch, it'd be much easier. The simple fact of the matter is they must actually transition it as it flies. And remember what Renuka said? She said, sometimes they don't have wind at all. So you're back to the old system, so to speak. And sometimes you have way too much. So not only are you changing the engines, but you have to rechange them back. So that's why it is so difficult. So that's the analogy. I want to show something about Ireland. I mean, this is just to show that what is possible. Ireland as an island has the highest penetration of non-synchronous generation in the world, except for some small islands, but I won't go into that. If you look at the bottom, curve, so this is May 10th, 2022, pretty recent. The yellow and blue line at the bottom are showing wind and load. So I'll ask one question. What is extraordinary about, so that's wind and load. The wind is lower than the load. The total energy that day in the top left-hand corner turns out to be 53% over the day came from wind. What is extraordinary about those two curves? At least it should strike you as extraordinary. Anyone? It looks like the wind is tracking the load. Is that correct? Or am I wrong? It does look like the wind is tracking the load. Is that correct? Which is extraordinary because wind is variable. What's actually happening is on the top right-hand corner of that colorful diagram is that the system operator is curtailing the wind to keep it at a certain level because they can't go over a certain level for dynamic reasons, etc., which I won't go to do with the power electronics. So you can see the laws of physics are determining this, the physics that the system operator dictates. And they're basically saying, so in fact, the reason it looks like it's tracking it is because they're curtailing it. And therefore, as the load increases, they can increase the wind. So it's a very windy day, but they curtailed a lot of wind. So back down to this. So the Global Power System Transformation Consortium that I'm a part of at the moment, the report on the top left-hand corner is the 100% report. Coming out of that, we got together with 6 system operators in the world: Texas, Australia, the UK, California, Ireland, and Denmark. And the reason we picked those 6 was, arguably, they have the highest penetrations of variable renewables in the world. Those 6 system operators are facing very similar problems together. We got them together with some of the research organizations at the bottom left, and it's the opposite of divide and conquer, it's unite and build. So those system operators knew that they had to, if they're going to do this quickly, they're going to have to work together, they're going to have to work with the research community, and they're going to have to work globally, because Australia is a long way away from Denmark, but they share a lot of common problems at the moment with regard to high penetration renewables. And we have many different pillars. The one, number 1 is the research pillar. Just to Renuka's point about human manpower, etc. Number 3 is about producing curriculum for universities, etc. So that's going to change. So that is the organization that me and my colleagues have set up, and I think it's very familiar with what we're talking about here. People need to work together. And the bottom right-hand corner shows that it was launched. All those people there, there's the Secretary of Energy of the United States, the UK, the CEO of GE, they're all involved together. So this is a diagram that I've used from the GPST that I think is very relevant today. I'm not going to go through each box in any way. And I've put in Swissgrid and MISO up there. Usually I have it with the 6 system operators, but I'm trying to make the point. The system operators are on the left-hand side. And what they're trying to do is objective to maintain reliable supply and demand at least cost. That's what they're told to do. That's what Renuka and Swissgrid are trying to do. But over on the right is the government has something to say about that. They could increase the reliability standards or decrease them, or so they have some influence on it. It's not just sitting there. But below that is the investment community, the manufacturers. They must make stuff to sell into the grid to put onto it. So there's this sort of circle that goes. The politicians, they influence the objective. The system operator acts to that objective, and in there is the laws of physics. But then the investment community down the bottom, they sell equipment into it. And this is where the chicken and egg problem and the cart before the horse problem starts to become an issue. So it's a system. And it's a bit like a Swiss public transport system situation. The fact of the matter in this country that you can get off a train, you're going somewhere, you get off a train, and 1 minute later the bus is there is pretty amazing. Mind you, when the train is late, there's no bus. So it does screw up sometimes, but not often. I'm going to skip this slide for brevity. I spent some time in Canada recently. I lived in Montreal for a while. Best city in the world in the winter, in the summer. Worst city in the world in the winter. But this shows you a map on the right-hand side of the whole of the northeast of the continent of North America. It shows, there's no names in there, but essentially you've got New York, New England in there with Quebec and Ontario, whatever. And one of the things we looked at is, could you go to 100% renewables in that region? And the reason we looked at it was because Quebec have storage. Now, they have real storage, yeah? Switzerland has storage, but not real storage. Quebec has, I think, 178 terawatt hours behind the dams. How much energy does Switzerland use in a whole year? 60, yeah. So they have real storage. And in fact, this is where the car comes into play. So you see the car, that's my electric car again, 2.4 billion. So what's that number relevant to that car? You would need 2.4 billion of my electric car to meet the storage that Hydro-Quebec has. And people tell me that we're going to balance the grid with electric cars. I mean, 1.4 billion represents what? Total number of cars in the world today. And this is only the Northeast. So this idea that somehow we're going to balance the grid with electric cars is, frankly speaking, nonsense. Yeah. Now, on a day-to-day basis, they can certainly help, but there's some issues they can never help with. The graph there on the left shows that if we were to operate them all together, it'd be much cheaper. So it shows that there's benefits. So in the Northeast, to be honest with you, I think if New England, New York, and the Canadians could get together and do something, there is huge benefit. It's not going to happen, though. You know, it's just not going to happen. In fact, what's interesting about Canada, not only will it not happen north and south, but it's even more difficult east to west, which is extraordinary, but that's Canada for you. And the top right-hand corner, I've put it in, can we build infrastructure? One of the single reasons that this may not happen, there's other reasons too, is that you're going to have to build more transmission, and of course, people are not going to let you do that. So speaking about the storage issue, people then said, well, why don't we use heat? Because if you look at heat, there's an enormous amount of energy. I mean, Switzerland uses electric heating, but you know, if we electrified heat is even bigger than electricity. We could actually do some storage. But the simple fact of the matter is, you know, engineering is the art of approximation. You should know the answer before you do the analysis. You know, it's very simple. If you look at heat storage, yeah, it's V equals A cubed and A equals 6A squared. Why are they relevant? The volume is the amount of heat you can store. But the expense is the area, because you have to enclose it. And the expense goes up as square, but the volume goes up as cubed. What that means is heat storage is cheaper as it gets bigger. So this idea of having a smart storage heater in your house is nonsense. If you look at the cost curve, it shows you on a meter cube basis how much cheaper it gets. So that's actually a building in China that's got some sort of centralized heat storage. Heat storage works at scale. It does not work in a private house. Well, it does work, but it's much more expensive. So I think there's sort of simple engineering analysis like that some policymakers need to be taught. And they could probably, well, I don't know, do you think they'd understand this? A cubed, A squared, not sure. The last slide is a slide given to me by one of my ex-BSc students, Ronan Doherty. I haven't changed it in any way except for the top part. Some laws we know and others it's too early to tell. Everything else is the same. Because to be honest with you, I should have really used, instead of using the law of thermodynamics, I would have used Maxwell's equations. But anyway, it's laws of thermodynamics. And he shows you the evolution. So the laws of thermodynamics since 1800 haven't changed. The other one shows you digital's revolution, the Moore's law. And it's changed, isn't it? It's going up and up. So this idea, the digital, and this is where I could be very nasty and controversial. The digital community tell us in the electrical engineering business, we're not innovative enough and all the rest of it. We've reached the limit. They haven't, yeah? And that's the difference. And therefore, this idea that digitalization is important, I'm not going to be, you know, it's useful. But this idea that digitalization is going to solve a lot of these problems is, frankly speaking, nonsense. It'll help, but it won't solve them. So conclusions are, the energy transition requires discipline. And I mean that from the point of view of, you know, Swiss discipline in terms of organization, and the lady doing the yoga. The laws of physics are not flexible. They're just not flexible. Yeah? Policies may need to adapt. In fact, policies will have to adapt. So this idea that somehow regulators say, oh, it's just a matter of price incentives. The electrical engineers say, it's just a matter of you understanding that there's some constraints, and once you understand them, then you can do your job. And then good ideas may have poor outcomes. I think it's very important. If you have a good idea in this system at the moment, the problem is the system is so interconnected that your good idea that you look at might be a great idea in the context you look at it, but when you take it into the context of a bigger system, it may not be a good idea. And global dance partners are needed. It definitely is an area in which people need to work together. That's me done. I'd like to thank Nicole and Maurice and others, and also my students and colleagues who I get the slides from. Thanks.
A professor who thanks his students, how nice. I would suggest that we've been talking about Swiss discipline. It has let us down a little bit. We're a little bit behind schedule. So I suggest we just jump right into the panel discussion about strong European power systems. Mark, you can just stay here. You'll get your gift bag afterwards, of course, as well. And if I can ask the other panelists on stage as well, we've already seen and heard from Renuka Chatterjee. Thank you very much for joining us as well. Then we have Maurice Dierig, Head of Market at Swissgrid.
Got the names and everything.
And we have two other system operators here. That would be Tavi Veskimäki, CEO of Ellering. That's the Estonian transmission system.
Is that all right?
Welcome.
Hi.
Hello. And last but not least, sia il benvenuto, Guido Guida. He's the Head of International Institutional Affairs from Terna, of course, Italian electricity transmission system operator. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. I suggest we dive right in with our three transmission operators here on this panel. Again, with one question going to all of you, if I could just ask you to kind of answer them individually, which is very interesting. Mark just showed us what the job would be. Simply demand balance and be reliable, cost efficient, and at all locations and times. It sounds so easy. However, it's probably one of the tricky things to do. So if I ask you all, how do you assess and how do you ensure grid stability and security of supply today, and maybe looking forward a little bit in 2025 and in 2030? Shall we start with Italy? Guido, please.
Yeah, thank you very much. And first of all, thank you for the invitation. It's an honor to be here today in this panel. So the main challenge we have as Italy, but I can say worldwide, is to integrate renewable energy sources. So this is the main challenge. And if we see what happened at the European level, the Commission with the Fit for 55 package, but also with the Repower EU communication issued recently in May, push for a strong acceleration of the decarbonization in Europe. And this means also an acceleration of renewable energy sources. So the key drivers in order to assess disability is to the first one is to invest in infrastructure to allow the integration of these renewable energy sources. If I see what happened in Italy, so reaching the target means install 70 gigawatt of renewable energy sources. 70 gigawatt is very huge amount. This is a target by 2030, 8-9 gigawatt per year. So we need a huge investment, as the colleague from MISO said. We need to transfer the energy from the location where this energy is produced to the north, from the south of Italy to the north, because the third of the consumption in Italy is located in the north. Whilst the wind generation, the solar generation is located in the main islands, Sicily and Sardinia, and the south. So this is the reality, and we have to invest more in order to do that. Otherwise, we have a situation in which the power plants are connected to the grid, but at the end, they cannot produce because the capacity, we have not enough transfer capacity to transfer this energy. So it's important to increase transfer capacity from regions, but also to increase interconnection with the other countries. It's really important and to see not only interconnection with the, if I see, and I talk about Italy, with Northern European countries, so with Switzerland, with Austria, France, but also Italy is a natural hub in the Mediterranean. So it's important to have a link with the other countries like the Balkans area, the North Africa, with Greece, and so on. So
which you do at the moment, and we'll be talking about this.
Yeah, and this is, I think, is an important thing. So in Italy, we have also a lot of requests of offshore wind generation. And having the adequate infrastructure to connect this offshore wind generation to the grid and transfer this energy to the node is one of our tasks. The second point, the key drivers, I think that it's really important to mention is the permitting procedure. I think that, if I remember well, Yves Zumwalt said this morning that very few power plants has been built in the last years. Is the same case of Italy. So it's important that there is an acceleration. We need an acceleration of the permitting procedure for this RES generation. The European Commission is doing the first steps with the REPowerEU communication, identify these areas where we can have the acceleration for these renewable energy sources. But it's important to say that together with the renewable energy sources, there is an acceleration also for the authorization, for the permitting of the whole infrastructure are needed in order to transfer this energy, to connect this generation to the grid and transfer the energy.
So to have a mix there as well. Let me change country and go straight to Estonia. When I hear investment, of course, that brings me to you, Taavi Veskimägi, who has been a former finance minister of his country. So the money is probably one of the key drivers as well in your industry at the moment. Let us speak about your country and the challenges and where you see the key drivers are at the moment.
Good afternoon from my side as well, and thank you for having me. Maybe just a couple of short observations from my side to somehow put it in the context of today's discussion here in the Lucerne, that maybe the first, because Elering is not only the electricity transmission system operator, we are electricity and gas transmission system operator. Basically, we are, in that sense, bundled system operator. And I think this is really makes sense to respond today's challenges, that I think we are talking about not electricity, but we are talking about energy. And especially if we are looking next winter, I think something 1/3 of European generators based on the gas, and I think the largest challenge, definitely short run, looking for the next winter, is how to really secure gas supplies for the gas-fired power plants. That I think maybe someone who really noticed the 17th of August, we've been the curtailment situation in the Baltic Sea region. Due to that, maybe they had price ceiling once again growing from 4,000 to 5,000 euro per megawatt hour, but it doesn't matter. But I think this kind of, not electricity, but about energy, if you talk about challenges coming winter. Another, of course, big issue is related that definitely for us as a small system, definitely this response is definitely not country or nation-based, but this is definitely the region or pan-Europe. I think we don't look those challenges based on our own generation adequacy. We're definitely looking at pan-Europe or regional adequacy as such, and I think the main threat there are really that the split of the system and the market. That we already have heard an announcement from a couple of system operators that okay, we start to curtail interconnectors between the countries, and I think this is the really dangerous, and I think it at the end of the day is more costly and put the extra risk for security of supply for all. That I think acting together, this is some kind of value, and especially for the small system as we have. And
can I just ask for a better understanding when you speak about collaboration? Are you linked with the other Baltic states as well?
Yeah, definitely. We are very well linked. That not only with the other Baltic states, but we are very well linked also with the Nordics, and via Poland also with the continental Europe power system. We still are part of the former Soviet Union frequency area, but of course we can come back to this item later on. But of course, one challenge how to get rid of the Russian impact to Russian aggression towards Ukraine, but I think we have prepared to mitigate this risk already last 10 years, and thanks with the continental Europe colleagues in the light of the Russian aggression right now, this kind of sense of urgency increased, and we have legally and also technically ready to synchronize the Baltic states time of 3 to 5 hours with the continental Europe power system. But this is more from the security, from the operational point of view. But if you talk about the generation adequacy as such, what is the issue for the next winter, then definitely I see that if everyone start to look their own national supply-demand balance, then definitely I think we are running into the trouble. And if we start to really curtail interconnectors between countries, I think maybe someone noticed that Norwegian transmission system operators a couple of weeks ago announced that they are maybe curtail the interconnectors towards to Sweden. I think this is the really bad sign. This is really bad sign, and I think we should, as a TSO community in Europe, I think we should really respond that and say that this is really unacceptable action. And my last point really, if just put it in the light of today's discussion, that I think there are a lot of such views that, okay, somehow the planning economy better than market economy, that current market setup maybe doesn't work, that we need more planning and more planning economy. I've been that time, Soviet time, young guy. I maybe don't know exactly how this planning economy worked, but I at least experienced the consequences of the planned economy. That basically there wasn't anything in the shops, that basically only empty shelves there. And I think the planning economy definitely not the right response to today's problems. We should definitely develop further the market and maybe really market design as such to really respond this kind of challenges better as we have done so far. But even I can say right now, coming from the northern part of the Europe, that basically even if we look at market, then and I talk about the day ahead market, then definitely if we experience the last decade, 10 years or so, day-ahead prices level of 25 to 35 euro per megawatt hours. Of course, no one really make the investments based on that prices, because there was huge over-investments decades before. Now this market changed, maybe changed it much more quickly than we expected due to Russian aggression and due to economic recovery after the pandemic. But my last sentence really, but now we see that basically, just to give you Estonian example, the basically generators who like to get or apply to a grid connection applications basically 4 times more than our peak load. There is this economic incentive really there, and private investors acted very bold and like to make those investments. Only problem that society and politicians not can accept these high prices meantime. And I think this is the definitely challenge for next winter as well, how to keep society behind the market, not to water down the market as such.
One of the big challenges, and if I want to open this as quickly as possible, don't worry, because it's, you know, I think we have a lot of questions as well. Just, Motirik, the challenge that we just heard, I guess it's the same for Swissgrid, no, at the moment?
I would say that the 3 things I tend to think about are, first of all, water. And I like to think about water in the shapes of rain and snow. I haven't seen too much rain recently, and a friend of mine showed me a picture his dad took in, I think, 1967 or 1968 in the Valais, standing on the top of their house with the mountains in the background in July. The mountains were white-capped, full of snow. He took the same picture with his sons standing on the roof of the same house, looking at the mountains in July this year. Nothing, green. So that is a problem. So most of all, and especially for the coming winter, I tend to think about water. The second thing I tend to think about is how we use the infrastructure. And in particular, we talk about cross-border trade, cross-border capacity. So if you take the border between Switzerland and the northern countries, so Germany, Austria, there's a thermal capacity installed of about 12 gigawatts. And there are situations where we can use only 800 megawatts because of all sorts of constraints that come out of the grid modeling. that's not good. So we need to think about how do we get the utilization of the capacity up? How do we get to true constraint-free use of the infrastructure? And the third thing I think about a lot, especially recently, is the sun. Not because of the drought, I've noticed that, but because if you look at Switzerland, and it's very interesting what Matthias Finger said at the end about the infrastructure front, because we've done some bottom-up modeling to look at how you could do massive solar deployment, but not at the city or community or cantonal level, but at the Swiss federal level, which is your point. And there is a solution there. The question is, how do you get it built? How do you get people behind that? And how do you get then that sort of energy in the system and managed? And I think the thing I worry about, in brackets, I'm not really a person to worry, otherwise I also couldn't hold this job, but I think we've reached a level of societal delusion. I'll not be too controversial, I had other words in mind, but this is an official forum. We've come to a point where we believe that stuff is just there and it works. We don't know why. We have no idea why power comes out of the socket. And I think we need to get back to a point that people understand that none of this is for free, none of it is a given, all of it has to be worked for, it has to be deployed. And yes, it will also be installed in your backyard. And from that on, there's my second worry, which is basically your point about physics preceding policy. I call that regulatory delusion. We have come to a societal place where we think that if we write a piece of paper, physics will follow. And my joke about that a few years back was we had problems with vegetation management. And I said, well, why don't I write a regulation that forbids trees to grow? It solves the problem, doesn't it? And we've gotten into a mindset where we think we write something, as you say, we haven't solved the technological problem, but we've already got the regulation to forbid us from innovating. I think that will be a major blocking point also for the whole climate change discussion.
Can I pick up on one of the delusion topics you were mentioning, because it's one of the questions we have as well. That, you know, the thing that you alluded to, that we took energy, we took electricity for granted for so long. And, you know, it just comes out of the socket. And as you say, people probably don't even know how and why. I would be interested in your perspective there as well. Is that the same in the United States? I guess I know the answer. And how do we convince people to, you know, to the importance of the question at hand? And as we discussed before, how can we, you know, make sure that we have enough in the future? And how do we convince them, you know, kind of making a step back to Switzerland, to be part of a grid, of a system? What do you think? What is the best way to do that?
Yeah. So, you know, fences are great until they're not, right? So you may not want your neighbor walking on your yard, but if he's going to help you or she's going to help you, you absolutely want to be sharing your backyard space or front yard space. I want to tie it back to the physics conversation we've been having. I think markets will help. All good ideas don't have to have a bad outcome if we let the marketplace optimize the good ideas, right?
But don't we see the opposite at the moment?
Yeah, we see. And the subsidies are an important element of that. And that's where back to, we don't want to write laws that want, you know, we probably write laws for cut trees often, right? So that's what we write. But when we write these policies or have subsidies, they interfere with the marketplace. So if you kind of let the marketplace optimize the good ideas that we have, be it storage, be it demand response. At MISO, we have 10% of our demand will respond during emergency situation, it'll go back. I was actually baffled when I heard Japan at the Swissgrid conference that they got 3 nuclear generators worth of demand back down during an earthquake. And I'm like, if you make public appeal, I don't know that it would happen in the United States that fast. So, I mean, not that there isn't, you know, people trying to respond to the public appeals, but I don't think that can be our only choice. But there is no one answer, in my opinion, be it storage, be it demand response, be it, you know, wind and solar, or the net zero virtual power plants. There's lots of ideas, but I think the markets need to overlay the physics in all the way from the planning time frame, years ahead, to days ahead, months ahead, days ahead, and even to the day ahead in real-time markets. If you overlay the physics and understand the boundaries of the market conditions and you don't subsidize on top of that, I think you can get to the right outcome. Short of that, I would say that, you know, grid operators really have only one choice, I guess maybe two. So far, they've been matching supply to demand, and if there isn't enough supply, we'll match demand to supply. And we don't want that, right? We don't want that, and if we don't want that, we kind of have to let these ideas play out, and maybe actually have an orderly transition sometimes, and I say this with utmost love, that we can't have an emotional transition to the clean future. We have to have an orderly transition, so we have to let the markets play out, let the investments play out, and work through it. And I'm convinced as I watched the climate remotes and read a lot of this, I know the temperature heating is coming, but I just don't know if we try to accelerate, we are going to be, days without lights. But here's the important thing. When you're in extreme weather, you get a little bit of grace when the lights go out. When it's like a day like this and lights just suddenly go out, you're not going to get any grace. We would all have failed in ensuring the lights stay on. So it's important to get those good ideas to work with each other and play them out without subsidies.
I'm well aware of the risk of jumping from one topic to another, but I want to keep this as kind of related to the question as possible. Let me just go to Guido, because we have a terrific question for you. We all know Switzerland and Italy have been partners for a long time. There are voices and worried voices as well that Italy might be getting away from Switzerland as the situation with Europe is not solved as it is. I heard and read about closer links to Austria at the moment. You are working with other countries as well. There's a specific question to you. What are the interests of Italy and Terna, to be specific, to keep Switzerland connected to the continental European grid as much as possible, that it stays the way it has always been?
Good question.
I wish it were from me.
So what is important is that we cannot disconnect Switzerland from the European system. Switzerland is the middle of the European system. Switzerland is important, like France, like Austria, like Slovenia, and we are operating just today the system in an integrated way, and we cannot say that we cannot operate without Switzerland. So I think that there are today some challenges with the European Union, with the Commission, so on. I think that we have to solve them. And also to be able to exchange this kind of flexible resources as Switzerland has in the most efficient way, I think.
So that famous transit, Germany, Italy.
Yeah, but also, if I may, I said that we are working in integrating also the Mediterranean area. So we operate in the METSO, that is the Association of the Mediterranean Countries, the European plus the MENA countries, North Africa and the Middle East. There are, especially following the energy crisis we have today, there are a lot of new projects or investments of renewable energy sources with the specific corridor linking North Africa with Europe. We are working in a connection with Tunisia, but for sure there are other projects with Egypt, Morocco, Algeria. So there are
going to Macedonia as well, no?
To Macedonia. Yes, you are right. So it's something we have to think about, and we should be able in the future to transfer this kind of energy. Will be available from the south to the north of Europe. So North Africa, South Europe, North Europe. So in order to integrate really the two systems, it's a benefit for all.
Before we come to another European Union country, I was just wondering, Mark, the Irish are known as being avid Europeans. I don't know how avid European you are, but if you hear about the problems we have and the discussions we have, I mean, there have been critics saying Switzerland is just cherry picking. Are we cherry picking?
Well, I don't know if I'm an avid European. I'm a European. So, are you cherry picking? Of course you are. Everyone cherry picks, don't they? Well, you do. I mean, you always tell your own side, don't you? I hope you do.
Do we? I don't know.
But if you're not cherry,
is it always the wise thing to do?
But if you're not cherry picking, you're not being human. So you are cherry picking. But I think the thing is the compromise. People mention it. There has to be a compromise. I mean, the fact that Europe and Switzerland are at enemies, there seems to be some controversy between them. In this regard, it's crazy. I mean, if people want to decarbonize, you have to do it across the whole continent. You have to do it across the whole world. So whatever they do about all the other things, they should park those and take all this energy stuff and say, make that the best it can be, and that's it. And leave all the other stuff on the side. I mean, it's crazy. It's classic politicians. I mean, we have politicians who say things, going back to some of the previous things, I think we need there are politicians who've said things which are clearly wrong, but no one substantial will call them out. I mean, if a politician says something really dumb here on Swissgrid, Yves is not going to come out in the newspaper and slam him, right? Because he'll lose his job, or Michelle will give out to him. But the simple fact of the matter is they have to be called out. So what's his name? There was a European commissioner, I think he's from Estonia or some of those places. He was in charge of energy a few years ago. And he said in 2015, smart grids is Europeans' answer to shale gas. I mean, that's complete nonsense. I mean, that is total and absolute nonsense. Smart grid is the answer to 10% of shale gas, but we need the other 90%. I was in a room one day with a bunch of politicians in Ireland, ministers, and one of my colleagues in academia challenged me on the fact that we needed to build transmission because he said, but smart grid can do it. And again, smart grid can do something, but we still need to build transmission. But he was an architect, but he was taken more seriously than I was. Why? Because he was 60, I was 35, I was young and boisterous and rude, and he was believed. We need to call out some of this stuff. A lot of it is nonsense. I mean, again, are you going to balance a grid seasonally with electric cars? No. Yeah. You're not going to do it. There's lots of very simple physical facts that we can prove without much difficulty. And the politicians are saying stuff just completely off the top of their head. And the problem is then you want society the following day say, the politician said. So how are you supposed to manage this? If you want society on board, you need to have a situation where somebody checks the politicians and says, that's completely and absolutely wrong. And how dare you say it? And nobody's doing that. Because the system operators can't, MISO can't, I'm pretty sure MISO cannot criticize the governors, right, in Indiana, correct? They have to be very...
We explain.
Yeah, explain.
Yeah. It's a very nice way to put it.
Yeah, but somebody has to not only explain, but hit them hard and say, that's completely wrong, we want you to retract it.
Let's go away from politics and maybe come to the kind of the operating bit. We've had an interesting question for Mr. Veskimägi. Estonia being well known for, the Baltic countries are known to be advanced in the digitization of the grid. What can we learn from you? Are there any advice you can give us? Any kind of feedback on, I don't know how good or how well the system in Switzerland, but is there something that you could give us as a giveaway?
Yeah, I think we have even discovered together with Swissgrid that which kind of lessons learned from the Estonian power system digitalization might be taken over. But I think it all starts economics, really, that it doesn't matter to make all those digitalization investments if there are no economic value. Maybe
is that the former finance minister speaking?
I think it's, if I somehow really advocate of the market economy, then definitely they're still there. This economics must be still there, otherwise it's really the pointless. And if we really see that prices are more fluctuating, of course, all what comes from the flexibility makes sense. And even I agree that this definitely you can do a very limited job with the flexibility. But even if we talk about the current pricing model, marginal pricing model, then definitely if even you can basically shift the load level of 10%, you can get a lot of such economic value due to lower prices. And I think where this digitalization really comes in, that we have already both electricity and gas central data hubs in place. We have remote readers both for electricity and gas, and now this active aggregators who actively lead the demand, I think they can really come in and plug their system directly against the central data hub, basically take this information directly from the central data hub. And I think now, if prices are such a rocket high, this kind of economics starts working. And I think this kind of digitalization tools really help. And I think what is the really important one, that we have done those investments earlier, not right now. And of course, maybe even if we basically already 7-8 years ago, when we built all this stuff, maybe that time it even was a bit unclear that where this economics comes from. But now we are quite well prepared. If those problems there, at least partial solution might come from this source.
Let me, almost at the end of the discussion, go back to one topic that we started with. It's almost like we opened that Pandora's box that we're trying to close now, which will not be possible, not in 2 minutes anyway. But Maurice, Dirk, if we look at Switzerland in the European framework and where it stands now and where it could stand, there's the clean energy package coming from the EU. Simple or not so simple question: how do we fit in there, if we do, and how can we move forward things there? Because it's a policy framework that is European, and yet we're in and not at the same time.
On the clean energy package, the answer is very simple: we don't fit in.
Yeah.
The electricity agreement that was negotiated and that was dropped was about the third package, not about the fourth or the clean energy package. And what we're beginning to see is that there are quite a number of things in the clean energy package for which we have no legislative mechanisms. We have no way to integrate ourselves, and vice versa. Brussels basically comes back and says, hey guys, sorry, no electricity agreement, so you cannot play anymore. Here's the nice yard, here are all sorts of interesting things happening, but you guys have to stay outside because there is no agreement. And we see that most dramatically at the moment in the area of regional security coordination. In the jargon, that's basically the transmission system operators working together to jointly analyze their networks and find out if the networks are in a stable condition, and if they are not, to prepare measures to get it back in a stable condition. And on a purely theoretical regulatory basis, we've been excluded from actually participating in those mechanisms, although we're smack in the middle of the synchronous area. The physics don't stop at the border. I think we can repeat that another 10 times or so. And if you want to operate the synchronous area, Central Europe, in a stable fashion, you will have to integrate the Swiss transmission system in some form or shape, also on a regulatory basis, but it's just not there at the moment.
That leaves a lot of questions to answer. And, it's 1:15. I only hope you're all still here, if there are more questions from the audience as well, to just kind of try to wrap this up on this important question about where we stand and where the international kind of collaboration stands. If I may, just 2 more minutes, but just to ask the Europeans here at the table, are there even open ears for the Swiss topics, questions for the Swiss situation? Because we talked about cherry picking. When you talk to your European counterparts, are we even a topic, or is it, as a lot of people are kind of worrying about, is it just a thing that, is mentioned from time to time, but Switzerland doesn't really matter?
If I may, I'll start, and I think the situation, maybe 2 interventions. First, that definitely energy policy is not the value-free, and I think we in Europe, together with the Swissgrid and other stakeholders from Switzerland, I think we exactly share the same values. And I think this is extremely important in current circumstances where we see the Russian aggression towards the Ukraine, that I think this kind of common enemy somehow, and not just that, but based on the different values, I think brings us much more closer together, maybe as it was still 7 months ago. And I think we have to use it, that we do not have resources and time and a point to somehow do this nitty-gritty stuff among ourselves when we see such a large divided world right now based on the geopolitics. That I think definitely Swissgrid must be the part of the ENSOE family, and then definitely Swissgrid and the Swiss system must be part of the European electricity market and grid.
That's something a lot of people like to hear, of course. Mr. Guida, probably the same opinion.
Yeah,
as well.
the same side, the same thing on my side. As I already said, as also Tavi said, Swissgrid is connected with the European system. We are working together since 20 years ago in defining the rules, and so it's important that we continue to cooperate together and to work together, especially within ENSOE.
That's good to hear. Final question, Mrs. Chatterjee. We talked a lot about Europe. Let me get North America in, the United States in. I know it's kind of a silly question, but if you had one advice to give us Europeans, or one key takeaway from that discussion, what would be the most important advice?
To get the grid planning early, the debate, right? So conclude the debate too. So have the debate, but conclude the debate. Lots of decisions are at stake. So what we have in the United States is we have a lot of debate, and sometimes the decisions take longer than they need to. That affects the...
Are the processes as long as here?
Yeah, in some cases. I mean, I didn't talk about long-range transmission planning. Building transmission lines is a very controversial topic, at least in the United States. It must be here too. But I think it's about having the debate, but concluding the debate to make decisions timely. So that would be my... Maybe all decisions won't be perfect, but I think we need to call the question, answer, and move on.
Better an imperfect decision than no decision, or a long decision. We'll take that on board. Thank you so much for the discussion. You're still around, I hope. So if there are more questions, please go and ask them. Also to Ms. Klinger, who is still here as well. So thank you so much. A huge applause for that podium. Thank you. Thank you very much. I'll leave you. Leicht verspätet, aber hoffentlich immer noch.
We're a little bit late, but we're going to let you go have lunch now. Maybe just a brief look at the artwork that has been done thus far. Maybe we can have a sneak peek. It's really worth it. I have had a look just before. All those of you who've joined us remotely, you will see it later on, but the people who are here in the room, maybe you can walk past it on your way to lunch. And now I see that those of you who have joined us remotely can see it as well. Integration in Europe, one of the big bubbles, one of the big topics on your piece of work. Energy strategy, integration, and more topics will be added in the afternoon. One of the big topics this afternoon I told you about is going to be cybersecurity. We're going to talk about labor market, one of the topics that has become crucial and controversial in your sector as well, the lack of experts. But before I start talking about the afternoon, I let you go have lunch. For those of you who join us remotely, en Goethe as well.